The January cold bit through everything at Fort Benning that morning. The kind of cold that makes old bones remember every hard landing, every night in a fighting hole, every year carrying weight the body was never meant to carry forever. Master Sergeant William Ridge stood in the armory at 0500, alone except for the rifles sleeping in their racks and the ghosts that never really left places like this. His hands moved over the M2010 ESR with the practiced certainty of a man who had cleaned more rifles than most people had fired. 58 years on this earth, 36 of them in uniform. The math was simple and brutal. 180 days until mandatory retirement. 6 months until the Army thanked him for his service and showed him the door like every other old soldier who had stayed too long. The bolt slid back smooth as prayer. The chamber was clean. It was always clean. Ridge did not believe in second chances with equipment or men. You maintained what mattered or you buried what you loved. He had learned that lesson in too many places that existed now only in classified reports and the dark hours before dawn. The door opened behind him. He knew the footsteps without turning. Colonel James Hargrove walked like a man who had earned the right to make noise, boots striking the concrete floor with the confidence of someone who had survived long enough to give orders instead of taking them. They had been privates together once, a lifetime ago, when Reagan was president and the Soviet Union was still a name that meant something. Hargrove stopped 3 feet behind him. The envelope in his hand made a soft sound against his leg. Ridge kept cleaning the rifle, waiting, because some conversations required you to finish what you were doing before you acknowledged what you already knew was coming. "Bill," Hargrove said, and the single word carried enough weight to sink ships. Ridge set down the cleaning rod. He still did not turn around. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made even blood look bureaucratic. "Mandatory retirement," Ridge said. "It was not a question." 36 years, Hargrove replied. "The regs are clear, you know that." Ridge finally turned. Hargrove looked older than he should, the stars on his collar somehow making the lines around his eyes deeper instead of softer. They had fought their first war together in a place most people could not find on a map anymore, and now they stood in an armory in Georgia arguing about paperwork and policy like the decades between had been nothing but forms filed in triplicate. 180 days, Hargrove said. He held out the envelope. "Official notification. Personnel wants you to start transition counseling next month. Job placement assistance. Resume workshops, the whole circus." Ridge took the envelope without opening it. He knew what it said. The Army loved efficiency, even when it was throwing you away. "6 months to what, Jim?" Ridge asked. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from men who had learned to speak softly because screaming never changed anything. 6 months to sit on a porch, watch TV, wait for my heart to stop because I do not have a reason to get up anymore." "You have earned rest," Hargrove said, but the words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. They both knew the truth. Men like Ridge did not retire. They just stopped moving and called it something else. "A man does not do enough," Ridge said. "He does what is needed until he cannot anymore. Then someone else picks up where he left off. That is how it works." Hargrove said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the sun was starting to pale the darkness, turning the world that particular shade of gray that existed only in the hour between night and day, when everything looked like a photograph from a war nobody remembered. "The all-service precision rifle competition," Hargrove said finally. "It is in 3 weeks, 50 shooters, Army, Marines, Air Force, SEALs, the best we have got. Winner gets a slot at the International Sniper Competition. $50,000 prize." Ridge felt something shift in his chest, small and sharp. He knew where this was going. Hargrove would not mention it otherwise. "I already signed you up," Hargrove said. "Consider it a retirement present. One last time on the line before you hang it up." Ridge looked at him, really looked at him, searching for the joke or the pity. He found neither. What he found was something worse: understanding. Hargrove knew what it meant to have the thing you were best at taken away by a calendar and a regulation written by someone who had never held a rifle in anger. "This is not charity," Ridge said. "No," Hargrove agreed. "This is me giving you a chance to walk out the way you walked in, on your feet, with your head up, shooting." Ridge turned back to the rifle. His hands found the bolt again, working it open and closed, feeling the mechanical perfection of steel on steel. The M2010 was a good rifle. Honest. It did not lie or make excuses. It was a tool that respected the man behind it if the man behind it respected the craft. "When is the first brief?" Ridge asked. "Tomorrow at 0800, Hargrove said. "Equipment check is Tuesday. Qualifiers start Friday." Ridge nodded once. Hargrove took that as the dismissal it was and turned to leave. He made it 3 steps before Ridge spoke again. "Jim," Ridge said, "thank you." Hargrove stopped but did not turn around. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "Just shoot straight and make these kids remember what it looked like before computers did all the thinking." Then he was gone, and Ridge was alone again with the rifles and the ghosts, and the cold Georgia morning pressing against the windows like it wanted in. Ridge finished cleaning the M2010, field stripped it, checked every component twice, then reassembled it with the kind of care most men reserved for newborns. The rifle was part of him now after so many years, an extension of intention, a conversation partner that spoke only in the language of wind and distance and the space between heartbeats. He locked it back in the rack and walked out into the morning. The sky was lighter now, bruised purple giving way to pale blue. He could see his breath. His right knee ached the way it always did when the temperature dropped, a souvenir from Fallujah and a roof that had not been as stable as it looked. He ignored it. Pain was just information. What you did with that information was what separated soldiers from civilians. The barracks were quiet. Most of the junior instructors were still asleep, enjoying the last hour before reveille turned the world back on. Ridge walked past them, his boots barely making sound on the polished floors. He had learned to move quietly in places where noise meant death, and the habit had never left him even in places where the only thing hunting you was time. His quarters were at the end of the hall, a private room that came with his rank and his position as senior marksmanship instructor. The space was sparse. A bed made tight enough to bounce a quarter, a desk with a single lamp, a footlocker that held everything he owned that mattered, which was not much, a photograph in a frame face down on the desk, too painful to look at, too important to throw away. Ridge sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope Hargrove had given him. The words were exactly what he expected. Standard format, regulation language, your service has been valued, your contributions are recognized. Effective July 15th, you are hereby retired with full honors and benefits. Report to transition services. Update your direct deposit information. Thank you for your dedication. Nowhere in the letter did it say what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life, after the only thing he had ever been good at was taken away. He set the letter on the desk and looked at the photograph. His hand hovered over it for a moment, then turned it face up. The young man in the frame stared back at him with eyes that looked like Ridge's own eyes, 30 years younger and infinitely more certain about the world. James Bridger, born January 10, 1985, died August 22, 2011, 26 years old, Marine Corps Infantry, Helmand Province, an IED that had been buried in a road that had been swept twice already that week. Ridge had been in Iraq when the notification team found him. Two officers in dress uniforms appearing in the middle of a firebase with expressions that told you everything before they said a single word. He remembered the chaplain's voice. "I regret to inform you. Killed in action. Honorable service. Deepest condolences." He did not remember what he said. He remembered the sand under his boots and the way the heat made everything shimmer like the world was not quite real, and thinking that if the world was not real then, maybe the notification was not real either. Maybe if he just went back to work, back to teaching Iraqi soldiers how to shoot, back to doing his job, then he could rewind time to before those two officers arrived, and James would still be alive, still angry at his father for never being home, still young enough to believe he was immortal. But time did not rewind. James stayed dead, and Ridge stayed in uniform because the uniform was the only thing he had left that made sense. He looked at his son's face for another moment, then set the frame back down, picture side against the desk. Some things you could only look at in small doses or they consumed you. The sun was fully up now. Ridge changed into his PT uniform and went for a run, 6 miles at a pace that would have impressed men half his age and embarrassed men his own age who had let themselves go soft. His knees complained. His back sent up warning flares. He ignored all of it and pushed harder because the pain meant he was still here, still capable, still useful. When he got back, the barracks were awake. Young soldiers moved through the halls with that particular combination of confidence and uncertainty that defined men who were good at their jobs but had not yet been tested by anything that would show them how good they really were. They nodded to Ridge as he passed. Some called him Sergeant. Some called him Ridge. None of them really knew him, and he preferred it that way. Relationships were liabilities. You could not lose what you never let yourself have. He showered, changed into his duty uniform, and headed to the chow hall. The morning brief was at 0800. He had time for coffee, and whatever passed for breakfast in an army that fed thousands of men on a budget designed for hundreds. The chow hall smelled like every chow hall in every base in every country Ridge had ever served in. Coffee, grease, disinfectant, institutional food cooked in bulk and served with efficiency instead of love. He filled a tray with eggs that had never seen a chicken, bacon that had more fat than meat, and toast that tasted like cardboard soaked in butter. He took it to a table in the corner, away from the clusters of younger soldiers laughing and talking about weekends and plans and lives that extended beyond the next deployment. He was halfway through the eggs when someone sat down across from him without asking. Ridge looked up. The man was young, maybe 30, with the kind of face that belonged on recruiting posters. Square jaw, clear eyes, perfect uniform, captain's bars on his collar, a ranger tab on his shoulder. The expression of someone who had never met a problem he could not solve with confidence and credentials. "Master Sergeant Bridger," the captain said. "I am Captain Derek Vance. I just transferred in as the new Advanced Technology Integration Officer." Ridge set down his fork. He did not offer his hand. "Technology integration," he said. "That is a new one." Vance smiled like he had been expecting skepticism and had prepared an answer. "The Army is modernizing, Sergeant. Ballistic computers, laser rangefinders, AI-assisted wind reading systems. My job is to integrate these technologies into our training programs and prove their effectiveness in competition and combat environments." Ridge picked up his coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, which felt appropriate. "Computers fail," he said. "Eyes and instinct do not. With respect, Sergeant, your methods are outdated." Vance leaned forward slightly, the smile still in place but his eyes harder now. "This is not about tradition versus progress. This is about giving our soldiers every possible advantage. And the data shows that technology-enhanced shooting produces tighter groups, faster target acquisition, and better hit probability at extended range. Ridge took another sip of coffee. He considered several responses. Most of them involved variations of telling this kid to go do something anatomically improbable. Instead, he said, "You ever shoot a man, Captain?" The smile faltered. The question had landed where Ridge intended. Vance recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "I have engaged targets in combat, yes. Twice. Both during my deployment with 2nd Ranger Battalion." Ridge nodded slowly. "I have shot 43, he said quietly. "Most of them before you were born. And I can tell you that not one of them died because my computer was better than theirs. They died because I waited longer, breathed slower, and trusted what I saw instead of what a machine told me I should see." Vance's jaw tightened. He was not used to being challenged. Ridge could see that. Men who looked like recruiting posters usually were not. The world bent around them instead of the other way around. "Then let us test that theory," Vance said. "The all-service competition. I am entering with a full tech-assisted system. If I win, it proves the future. If you win, I will personally apologize and recommend we keep teaching your methods." Ridge studied him. The challenge was not about science or training. It was about ego. This kid needed to prove he was right, needed validation that his expensive education and his shiny new systems were worth more than an old man who learned to shoot by reading Grass and Mirage. "You registered already?" Ridge asked. "This morning," Vance said. "Figured I would give these old-school guys something to shoot at." Ridge stood, picked up his tray. He looked down at Vance and saw what he had expected to see: confidence, arrogance, the certainty of someone who had never lost anything that mattered. "See you on the line, Captain," Ridge said. He walked away without waiting for a response, dumping his tray and heading for the door. Behind him, he heard one of the younger sergeants whisper to Vance, "Did you just challenge Ridge to a shoot-off? That man has forgotten more about shooting than most of us will ever learn." Vance's response was loud enough to carry. Then maybe it is time someone reminded him what he forgot. Ridge kept walking. The comment should have made him angry. Instead, it just made him tired. Every generation thought they had invented the wheel. Every young officer thought technology made them invincible. And every old soldier knew that when the bullets started flying and the radio stopped working and the batteries died, all you had left was training and instinct, and the will to do what needed doing even when everything else had failed. The morning brief was held in the same classroom where Ridge had taught thousands of soldiers over the years. The walls were covered with targets and ballistic charts and photographs of students who had gone on to become some of the best snipers in the military. Ridge's own photograph was up there somewhere, from back when he still had hair and hope. The room filled quickly. Ridge took a seat in the back, watching the younger instructors file in with their tablets and laptops and phones that could probably calculate ballistics faster than he could write them down. Times changed. Tools improved. But the fundamentals never did. Wind was still wind. Distance was still distance. And a bullet still only cared about physics, not about how expensive the computer was that sent it downrange. Colonel Hargrove walked to the front of the room and waited for the noise to settle. When it did, his voice carried that particular tone of command that separated officers who led from officers who managed. "Gentlemen," he said, and the single word pulled every eye forward. "In 3 weeks, this facility will host the annual all-service precision rifle competition. 50 of the best shooters from every branch: Army, Marines, Air Force, Navy. The stakes are a slot at international and $50,000. But more than that, this competition represents what we do here, what we teach, what we believe." He paused, letting that sink in. Ridge watched the faces around him, some eager, some nervous, some calculating odds and angles like this was just another qualification instead of what it really was: a measuring stick, a test not just of skill but of philosophy. This year is particularly significant, Hargrove continued, because this year we are seeing a shift, a debate, old methods versus new technology, tradition versus innovation, and I want to be clear about something. He looked directly at Ridge, then at Vance. Both have value, Hargrove said. Both have earned their place. But at the end of the day, only one thing matters. Can you put rounds on target when it counts? Everything else is just noise. The briefing continued with logistics and schedules and safety regulations. Ridge stopped listening halfway through. He had heard it all before. Same brief, different year, different war. The mechanics never changed, only the faces. When it was over, Ridge stood to leave. A hand touched his shoulder. He turned to find Marcus Holliday standing there, grinning with the kind of expression that came from men who had earned the right to smile at death and mean it. Doc Holliday was 56 years old and looked like he had been carved from the same mountain stone as Ridge. 6 feet tall, solid as ironwood, with eyes that had seen too much and refused to apologize for any of it. He had been Ridge's spotter for 20 years across 4 continents and more gunfights than either of them cared to count. If Ridge trusted anyone in this world, it was Doc. "Heard you signed up for the competition," Doc said. His voice was rough, damaged by too many years breathing dust and burned pits, and whatever else the Army put in the air and told you was safe. "Hargrove signed me up," Ridge corrected. "I just did not say no." Doc laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "That is the same thing and you know it. So who am I spotting for? You or one of these kids who think a computer can read wind?" Ridge looked at his friend and felt something uncomfortable move in his chest. Doc looked thinner than he should. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there 6 months ago, but Ridge did not ask. Men like them did not ask questions they did not want answered. "You spotting for me means you are still breathing," Ridge said. "So I guess that is the plan." Doc's smile faltered for just a second, so brief Ridge almost missed it. Then it was back, bright and hard and defiant. "Well then," he said, "let us give these youngsters something to remember before we both turn into museum pieces." They walked out together, 2 old warriors moving through a building full of young soldiers who did not know yet what these men had paid to make their jobs easier. Outside, the Georgia sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning cold and replacing it with the kind of heat that made you forget winter existed. "You good, Marcus?" Ridge asked quietly. Doc did not answer right away. He stared at the sky like he was reading something written there in clouds and contrails. Finally, he said, "You remember Beirut, '83. Ridge nodded. He remembered the barracks bombing, 241 dead, the smell of concrete dust and blood, the sound of mothers crying on phone calls home. "I remember thinking we were invincible," Doc said. "Young and stupid and convinced we would live forever because we were Americans and God loved us more than he loved the enemy. Then that building came down and I learned that God does not pick sides. He just watches." Ridge waited. Doc was leading somewhere, and you did not interrupt a man when he was finding his way to hard truths. "Got a call from the VA last week," Doc said. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Maybe 6 months. Maybe 12 if I am lucky and the chemo does not kill me first." The world stopped. Ridge heard the words, but they did not make sense, like Doc had spoken in a language Ridge used to know but had forgotten. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "Do not," Doc said sharply. "Do not do the sympathy thing. I am not dead yet. And I did not tell you so you would feel sorry for me. I told you because I need you to know. This competition, it is my last rodeo, Bill. I am your spotter one more time, then I am done." Ridge found his voice. It came out rougher than he intended. "We will beat this. New treatments, clinical trials. The VA will have options. Doc shook his head. No, we will not. I have seen the scans. It is everywhere. Liver, lungs, lymph nodes. I am a dead man walking. Only question is how long I stay on my feet. Ridge felt something break inside him, small and sharp like a bone snapping under pressure. He had lost men before. Too many men. Friends and brothers and soldiers whose names he still remembered in the dark. But Doc was different. Doc was the last piece of a world that made sense, the last connection to a time when Ridge knew who he was and what he was fighting for. How long have you known? Ridge asked. 2 months, Doc admitted. Wanted to be sure before I said anything. Did not want to worry you over a maybe. 2 months. Ridge had been teaching classes and running ranges and going through the motions while his best friend was dying and keeping it secret because he did not want to be a burden. I am still here, Doc said, reading Ridge's expression, and I am still your spotter. Nothing changes until everything changes. That is the deal. Ridge nodded because words were not working anymore. They stood there in the Georgia heat, two old men who had survived wars and losses and decades of service, facing the one enemy neither of them could outshoot or outthink or outlast. Finally, Doc clapped Ridge on the shoulder. Come on, he said. Let us go look at the gear. If I am doing this one last time, I want to make sure that rifle is perfect. No excuses. They walked toward the armory together, and Ridge tried not to think about how many more times he would make this walk with his friend beside him. Tried not to count the days like ammunition in a magazine running low. Tried not to imagine what the world would look like when Doc was gone and he was truly alone. The armory was cooler inside, air conditioned against the heat. Doc went straight to the spotting scope locker and started pulling equipment, checking lenses and mounts with the attention to detail that had kept them both alive through situations where inches mattered and seconds meant the difference between going home and going into a box. Ridge pulled the M2010 from its rack and laid it on the workbench. He had cleaned it that morning, but now he disassembled it completely, inspecting every component with fresh eyes. The barrel was good. No heat damage, no throat erosion. The bolt was tight. The trigger broke clean at 3 pounds, exactly where it should be. The stock was solid, no cracks, no stress points. This rifle would not fail him. The question was whether he would fail the rifle. Doc set up the spotting scope and peered through it, adjusting focus and parallax. You see that new kid? He asked without looking up. Captain Vance. Hard to miss him, Ridge said. He walks like someone told him he was special and he believed it. Doc grunted. Ranger Regiment, West Point. Perfect scores on every test. Never failed at anything in his life. Everyone fails eventually, Ridge said. The only question is whether they learn from it or break from it. Doc finally looked up from the scope. That is what worries me about kids like him. They get so used to winning that when they finally lose, they do not know how to handle it. They fold or they lash out or they blame everyone except themselves. Ridge thought about the challenge Vance had thrown at him in the Chow Hall. Let us test that theory. The arrogance of youth-thinking experience was just another obstacle to overcome with enough technology and confidence. He will learn, Ridge said, one way or another. You going to be the one teaching him? Doc asked. Ridge locked the bolt back into the rifle and cycled it once, twice, 3 times. The action was smooth as silk. I am just going to shoot, he said. What he learns from that is up to him. They worked in comfortable silence for another hour, preparing equipment that would not be used for weeks but needed to be perfect when the time came. This was the part of their job that civilians did not understand. The endless preparation, the obsessive attention to detail, the checking and rechecking and checking again, because when you finally squeezed that trigger at a target 2,000 yards away, there were no second chances. The bullet would go where physics demanded, and physics did not care about your intentions or your excuses. When they were done, Doc stretched his back and grimaced. Ridge saw it but did not comment. There were too many things neither of them was saying, and adding more felt like tempting fate. "Beer?" Doc asked. Ridge nodded. It was not a question that needed words. They walked to the NCO club, a squat building at the edge of the base that had been serving alcohol to sergeants since before Ridge was born. The place smelled like stale beer and old leather and decades of soldiers trying to forget things that would not stay forgotten. The bartender was a retired master sergeant who had lost his left arm in Baghdad and found purpose in pouring drinks for men who understood what it cost him. "2 beers," Doc said, holding up 2 fingers. "The good stuff." The bartender laughed. "We do not serve the good stuff, Sergeant, only cold stuff." "Then make it cold," Doc said. They took their beers to a booth in the back, away from the younger NCOs who were playing pool and telling stories that got bigger with every retelling. Ridge sipped his beer and did not taste it. He was thinking about numbers. 180 days until retirement. 6 months, maybe 12, before Doc was gone. 3 weeks until the competition. All of it counting down like a timer on a bomb nobody could defuse. "You remember why you started shooting?" Doc asked suddenly. Ridge looked at his friend, surprised by the question. "My father," he said. "Montana Ranch. He taught me when I was 8. Said a rifle was the last honest conversation left in the world." Doc nodded slowly. "My grandfather taught me. Korean War vet. Never talked about the war, but he would take me out to his farm and we would shoot tin cans off fence posts. He told me that shooting was about patience, about waiting for the exact right moment and trusting yourself to recognize it when it came." Ridge thought about his father, dead now 15 years, buried in a cemetery in Montana where the wind never stopped blowing. Thought about his son, dead 11 years, buried in Arlington where the grass was always green and the silence was always heavy. All of it connected by rifles and lessons, and the things fathers tried to teach sons before time ran out. "We are the last of something," Doc said quietly. "You know that, right? The last generation that learned to shoot without computers. The last guys who can read wind by watching grass. When we are gone, all of this goes with us." Ridge set down his beer. "That is why we teach," he said, "so it does not die with us." "You really believe that?" Doc asked. "You really think these kids with their apps and their ballistic calculators are going to remember how to do it the old way when their batteries die?" Ridge did not have an answer. He wanted to believe that the fundamentals mattered, that tradition had value, that 36 years of experience counted for something in a world that measured worth in gigabytes and processing speed. But he had been around long enough to know that progress was not about preserving the past. It was about replacing it. They finished their beers in silence, 2 old soldiers drinking to memories that no one else shared anymore. When they were done, Doc stood slowly, favoring his right side in a way that told Ridge the pain was getting worse. "See you tomorrow, Bill," Doc said. "Tomorrow," Ridge agreed. Doc walked toward the door, and Ridge watched him go, memorizing the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the determined stride of a man who refused to surrender even when the war was already lost. Then he was gone, and Ridge was alone again with his beer and his thoughts, and the knowledge that everything he had ever been good at was slipping away like water through his fingers. He sat there for another hour, not drinking, just existing in the space between what was and what was coming. Finally, he stood and walked back to his quarters through the Georgia night, the air warm and thick with the promise of summer storms that had not arrived yet. In his room, he lay on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow he would start preparing for the competition. He would clean his rifle and study ballistic tables and practice, until his hands remembered what his eyes could not always see anymore. He would do what he had always done. Put his head down and work and trust that the skills he had spent a lifetime building would carry him through one more time. But tonight, in the dark, he let himself feel what he never allowed in daylight. The fear that he was not good enough anymore. The certainty that Doc was dying and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The weight of knowing that in 6 months, the Army would thank him for his service, and he would walk out of this place with nothing but a plaque and a pension and memories that no one cared about except the men who had made them with him. And Ridge lay there in the dark and let himself feel all of it, because the alternative was feeling nothing at all, and nothing was the one thing he had promised himself he would never become. Outside, somewhere on the ranges, a shot rang out. Someone doing night training, someone practicing, someone preparing for something that mattered. Ridge closed his eyes and listened to the sound of that rifle speaking into the darkness, and for just a moment he was young again, and his father was beside him, and the world was full of possibilities instead of endings. Then the moment passed, and he was 58 again, and alone, and morning was coming whether he was ready for it or not. The sun came up on Tuesday like it had something to prove, burning off the morning haze with the kind of heat that reminded Ridge why he had never liked Georgia. Give him Montana cold any day. At least cold was honest. Heat just made everything shimmer and lie. He was already on the range by 0600, before the official training hours started, before the young instructors arrived with their coffee and their confidence. The rifle lay on the bench in front of him, and he was doing something he had not done in years, doubting himself. His right eye was worse this morning. He had noticed it while shaving, the way the mirror went soft at the edges, the way his own face looked like someone had smeared Vaseline across half of it. Macular degeneration, the VA doctor had called it 6 months ago. Age-related, progressive. No cure, just management. Reading glasses might help. Surgery was an option if it got bad enough. Ridge had thanked the doctor and walked out without filling the prescription. Reading glasses were for old men who had accepted they were old. He was not ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But now, looking through the scope at a target 600 yards downrange, he could see the progression. The reticle was not as crisp as it should be. The target blurred at the edges. His brain was compensating, filling in details from memory instead of actual visual input, and that was a dangerous game to play when a quarter inch of error meant the difference between a hit and a miss. He closed his right eye and looked through his left. Better, clearer, but shooting left eye dominant meant changing everything. 40 years of muscle memory built on right eye, right shoulder, right-handed bolt manipulation. Starting over at 58 felt like learning to walk again after a stroke. You planning to shoot or just stare at it? Ridge did not turn around. He knew Doc's voice the way he knew his own heartbeat. Rough, tired, but still carrying that edge of humor that came from men who had looked at death so many times they had stopped being impressed by it. Thinking, Ridge said. Doc walked up beside him and looked downrange. Thinking is dangerous at our age, he said. Start thinking too much and you remember all the reasons you should have quit years ago. Ridge finally looked at his friend. Doc was leaning on the bench more than standing next to it, and there was a tightness around his eyes that spoke of pain being managed but not conquered. He had lost weight. Not much, but enough that his uniform hung differently, enough that Ridge could see the outline of bones that should have been covered by muscle. You sleep last night? Ridge asked. Doc shrugged. Sleep is overrated. I will sleep plenty when I am dead. The words hung there between them, too honest to ignore and too raw to acknowledge. Ridge turned back to the rifle. He pulled the bolt, checked the chamber out of habit even though he knew it was empty, then slid it home again with a sound like a door closing softly. I need you to do something for me, Ridge said quietly. Doc waited. He was good at that. Waiting. Listening. Being the kind of friend who did not fill silence with noise just because quiet made most people uncomfortable. My right eye is going, Ridge said. Has been for months. If I am going to shoot this competition, I need to switch to left eye, which means I need to relearn everything. And I need you to spot for me while I do it. Doc was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I am telling you about it." Doc nodded slowly, processing this the way he processed everything. With calm assessment and without judgment. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "We could have been working on this already." "I did not want to admit it," Ridge said. "Felt like giving up." "Admitting you have a problem is not giving up," Doc said. "It is facing reality. And reality is something we have always been good at, you and me." Ridge picked up the rifle and moved it to his left shoulder. The weight felt wrong. The balance was off. Everything his body had learned over 4 decades screamed that this was incorrect, inefficient, dangerous. He forced himself to settle into the position anyway, left cheek to the stock, left eye to the scope. Through his left eye, the world was sharp again, clear, honest. "Better?" Doc asked. "Yeah," Ridge admitted, "better." "Then we practice," Doc said, "starting now. Because 3 weeks is not a lot of time to rebuild 40 years. They spent the next 2 hours doing nothing but dry fire practice. No ammunition, no noise. Just Ridge settling into the left-handed position over and over, learning how his body needed to move, where his hands needed to be, how to work the bolt from the opposite side without looking awkward or slow. Doc watched every repetition with the focus of a man who understood that details mattered. He did not offer advice unless asked. He just observed and waited and let Ridge work through the mechanics of relearning his craft. "Your shoulder is too high," Doc said finally. "You are compensating for the unfamiliar position by tensing up. Relax. Let the rifle find its natural point of aim." Ridge adjusted, dropping his shoulder, letting gravity do some of the work instead of fighting it with muscle. The position felt less forced, more organic. "Better," Doc confirmed, again. They ran through it 50 more times. By the end, Ridge's shoulder ached and his neck was stiff and he was sweating in the Georgia heat, but the position was starting to feel less like a costume and more like clothing. Still unfamiliar but wearable. "Live fire?" Ridge asked. Doc checked his watch. "We have got an hour before the brass shows up for the equipment inspection. Let us see what you can do." Ridge loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, chambered one, and settled into position. The target was 600 yards, standard qualification distance, something he could hit in his sleep with his right eye. The question was whether his left eye and his retraining could deliver the same result. He focused on his breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, steady, letting his heart rate drop into that space between beats where the world stopped moving and the only thing that existed was the rifle and the target and the tiny space between them that the bullet would travel. "Send it," Doc said quietly. Ridge pressed the trigger. The recoil was different on his left shoulder, sharper somehow, less absorbed. The rifle barked and bucked and settled, and downrange the target rang like a bell being struck in a church tower. "Hit," Doc called, "center mass, 3 o'clock 2 inches." Ridge chambered another round. The bolt manipulation was still clumsy, his left hand not as practiced as his right at the motion. But it worked. That was enough for now. He fired 4 more times. 4 more hits. None of them perfect, all of them within the acceptable zone. Good enough for qualification. Not good enough to win a competition against shooters who were not relearning their fundamentals 3 weeks before game day. "You will get there," Doc said, reading Ridge's expression. This is day 1. By day 20 it will feel natural. Ridge wanted to believe that. Wanted to trust that muscle memory could be rebuilt in 3 weeks when it had taken 4 decades to build the first time. But doubt was a patient enemy, and it had already started whispering in his ear that maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should withdraw. Maybe he should accept that his time had passed, and trying to prove otherwise was just pride wearing the mask of persistence. Doc must have seen something in Ridge's face because he walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. The grip was firm despite the sickness eating him from inside. "Listen to me, Bill," Doc said, and the use of his first name carried weight. "You are going to doubt yourself. That is human, but do not you dare quit on me. I did not stick around to watch you give up. I stuck around to watch you win one more time." Ridge met his friend's eyes and saw something there that hurt more than any physical pain. Determination, hope, the desperate need to see something good happen before the darkness came. Doc was dying and he knew it and he had accepted it, but he had not accepted going quietly into that night. He wanted to rage. He wanted to fight. And if he could not fight his own battle anymore, then he needed to see Ridge fight his. "Okay," Ridge said quietly. "Okay, we do this." "Good," Doc said, releasing his shoulder. "Now let us go face the circus." The equipment inspection was scheduled for 0900 in the main armory. Ridge and Doc arrived 10 minutes early to find the room already filling with shooters and support personnel. The energy was different from a normal training day. Sharper, more focused. This was competition mode, where every man was measuring himself against every other man and trying not to look like he was doing it. Captain Derek Vance was already there, surrounded by a cluster of younger officers and NCOs who were examining his setup like pilgrims at a shrine. Ridge could see why. The equipment was impressive. A custom rifle built on a chassis system that probably cost more than Ridge made in 6 months. An advanced ballistic computer mounted on a rail, its screen glowing with data and graphs. A laser rangefinder integrated into the scope. A weather station on a tripod that looked like it could predict tomorrow's forecast from 3 states away. It was the kind of setup you saw in magazines and trade shows, the cutting edge of precision shooting technology, and it announced very clearly that Vance was not here to participate. He was here to dominate. Ridge set his rifle case on an empty bench and opened it. Inside was his M2010, standard issue, 20 years old, maintained to perfection but utterly lacking in bells and whistles. No computer, no laser, just steel and wood and glass, the same fundamental design that had been putting bullets on target since before Vance was born. A few of the younger shooters glanced over, saw Ridge's setup, and dismissed it immediately. One of them whispered something to his buddy, and they both smirked. Ridge ignored them. He had stopped caring what people thought about his equipment around the same time he stopped caring what people thought about his age. Doc set up the spotting scope and began the inspection routine they had performed 1,000 times. Check the optics for clarity. Verify the reticle alignment. Confirm the mounting hardware was tight. Look for any signs of damage or wear that could compromise performance. While Doc worked, Ridge pulled out his data book. It was an old notebook, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, with a worn cover and pages that had been written on and erased and written on again so many times that the paper was soft as cloth. Inside were years of data, wind calls, elevation adjustments, temperature effects, density-altitude corrections. All of it handwritten, all of it learned through repetition and experience, all of it utterly analog in a world that had gone digital. Sergeant Bridger. Ridge looked up to find Vance standing over him, that recruiting poster smile firmly in place. The captain gestured at Ridge's notebook. "Is that your ballistic calculator?" Ridge closed the book. "It is my brain," he said, "just externalized." Vance chuckled like Ridge had made a joke. With respect, Sergeant, my system can calculate corrections for wind, spin drift, Coriolis effect, and temperature gradient in 0.3 seconds. How long does it take you to do that math in your head? I do not do math in my head, Ridge said. I read the wind and make an adjustment based on what I see. Takes about the same amount of time. But less accurate, Vance countered. Human observation is subject to bias and error. Data is objective. Data is only as good as the sensors collecting it, Ridge said, and sensors can fail. Eyes do not. Vance's smile tightened just a fraction. Well, he said, I guess we will find out whose method is superior. Looking forward to the competition, Sergeant. He walked away before Ridge could respond, which was probably for the best because the response forming in Ridge's mind involved several suggestions about where Vance could store his data. That kid needs a lesson in humility, Doc muttered. He will get one, Ridge said. Life teaches everyone eventually. The inspection proceeded efficiently. An officer from the range control office went from bench to bench, checking that every rifle was properly registered, every shooter had the required safety equipment, every piece of gear met the competition standards. When he reached Ridge's station, he barely glanced at the setup before moving on. Standard issue. Nothing to inspect. It either worked or it did not, and Ridge's record spoke for itself. When he reached Vance's station, the inspection took longer. The officer examined the electronic components, verified they met the rules allowing technology, made notes on his clipboard. Vance stood by, confident and relaxed, answering questions with the easy authority of someone who had memorized the regulations and knew he was well within them. After the inspection, Ridge and Doc headed to the range for live practice. This was where the real work happened. Not in the armory with clean rifles and perfect conditions, but outside with wind and heat and mirage that turned the air into a liar. They set up at the 1,000-yard line. Ridge wanted to push the distance, test his left eye at range, see how the new position held up when the target was small enough to doubt and far enough to punish mistakes. Doc settled behind the spotting scope and began his observations. Wind is 7 to 9 miles per hour, he called. Flags say right to left, but the mirage is showing a boil at 600 yards. Means there is a thermal pushing up, creating turbulence. Ridge processed this information the way he always had, not with computers or calculations, but with intuition built from 10,000 repetitions. He pictured the bullet's path, imagined how it would drift in the wind, visualized where it needed to start to end up where he wanted it. Hold 0.8 mils left, he said. Doc did not question it. He had learned years ago that Ridge's instincts were better than most people's instruments. Send it when ready. Ridge settled into the position. Left shoulder, left eye, the world sharp and clear through the scope. He found his breathing rhythm, let his heart rate drop, waited for that perfect moment between one beat and the next when everything stopped moving. The trigger broke clean. The rifle pushed back into his shoulder, different than his right side but not wrong. Just different. The bullet flew downrange, invisible, carrying 2,000 grains of intent toward a piece of steel that did not care about his problems or his doubts. Hit, Doc called, dead center, that is how you do it. Ridge worked the bolt left-handed, the motion still awkward but improving. The brass ejected and tumbled through the air, catching sunlight before landing in the dirt. He chambered another round and settled again. They shot for 2 hours, burning through ammunition and building the new muscle memory one round at a time. Not all of them were perfect. Ridge pulled some shots, jerked the trigger on others, misjudged the wind twice and paid for it with misses that rang in his ears like accusations, but more hit than missed, and that ratio was improving with each repetition. By the time they quit, Ridge's shoulder was bruised and his neck was stiff, and his left eye ached from the unfamiliar strain of being the primary instead of the backup. But he could feel it coming together. Slowly, painfully, but coming together. "You are getting it," Doc said as they packed up the gear. "Another week of this and you will be dangerous again." Ridge wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that practice would overcome biology and time, and the simple reality that he was 58 years old trying to relearn skills that most men never learned right the first time. But doubt was still there, patient and persistent, reminding him that want did not equal can. They were walking back toward the armory when a voice called out behind them, "Sergeant Bridger, wait up." Ridge turned to find a young soldier jogging toward them. The kid was maybe 19, skinny, with the kind of face that still held baby fat and the kind of eyes that had not seen enough yet to lose their optimism. His uniform was clean but worn, and he moved with the uncertain gait of someone who had not quite figured out how to carry himself like a soldier yet. "Private First Class Anthony Castillo," the kid said, slightly out of breath. "I was told to report to you, Sergeant." Ridge looked at Doc, who shrugged. This was news to both of them. "Report to me for what?" Ridge asked. The kid shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Colonel Hargrove said you needed an assistant for the competition, someone to help with equipment prep and range setup. He assigned me." Ridge studied the private. There was something off about this. Hargrove did not assign assistants without reason, and the look on this kid's face suggested he was not exactly thrilled about the assignment either. "What is your background, Castillo?" Ridge asked. The private hesitated. "Infantry sergeant, 82nd Airborne. I have been in 14 months. "And before that?" The hesitation stretched longer. "Los Angeles, Sergeant. I enlisted as an alternative to juvenile detention. Judge said military or jail. I picked military." Ridge saw it now. The tension in the kid's shoulders, the defensive posture, the eyes that looked everywhere except directly at Ridge's face. This was not an assistant assignment. This was a last chance. Someone had screwed up badly enough that they were on the edge of being kicked out, and Hargrove had thrown them at Ridge as a final attempt at rehabilitation. "What did you do?" Ridge asked. "Fight," Castillo admitted. "Another soldier said something about where I am from. I hit him. Got an Article 15. This is my last warning before they process me out." Ridge felt something familiar stir in his chest. He had been this kid once. Different circumstances, different decade, but the same fundamental problem. Anger looking for a target. Pride that had not yet learned the difference between strength and stubbornness. A young man who needed someone to show him that discipline was not about submission, it was about self-control. "You know how to shoot?" Ridge asked. "Qualified expert on the M4, Castillo said with a hint of pride. "That is not what I asked. I asked if you know how to shoot." The distinction landed. Castillo's expression shifted from defensive to uncertain. "I am not sure what you mean, Sergeant." "Qualifying expert means you can hit a target at 300 meters when someone tells you to. Knowing how to shoot means you understand why the bullet goes where it goes. One is passing a test. The other is learning a craft. Which one are you?" Castillo did not have an answer. Ridge looked at Doc, who gave a small nod. They had both been thinking the same thing. This kid was a problem looking for a solution, and Ridge was running out of time to build new muscle memory on his own. Maybe teaching someone else would force him to articulate what he knew in ways that would reinforce his own retraining. "Okay, Private," Ridge said, "you want to stay in the Army. You want to avoid jail and make something of yourself. Then you are going to learn to shoot, not qualify, not pass a test. Actually shoot. And you are going to do exactly what I tell you when I tell you without argument or attitude. Understood?" Yes, Sergeant, Castillo said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before. Hope, maybe. Or just the relief of someone who had been drowning and suddenly felt solid ground under their feet. Good, Ridge said. Be at the range tomorrow at 05:30. Bring your rifle and whatever you think you know about shooting. We are going to start over from the beginning. Castillo saluted, realized halfway through that Ridge had not saluted first, and turned it into an awkward wave before jogging off toward the barracks. That was kind of you, Doc said quietly. That was selfish, Ridge corrected. I need someone to talk through my process with, and he needs to learn patience. We use each other. If you say so, Doc said with a knowing smile. They continued walking. The sun was past its peak now, starting the long slide toward evening. Ridge's body ached in all the familiar places, and some new ones courtesy of the left-handed shooting. He needed food and rest, and probably a handful of ibuprofen. What he wanted was a time machine that could take him back 30 years to when his eyes worked, and his body did not hurt and Doc was not dying. Since he could not have that, he settled for the present and tried to make it enough. That night, Ridge sat in his quarters with his notebook open, reviewing the day's data. He had fired 67 rounds, 49 hits, 18 misses. The hit percentage was lower than he wanted but better than he had feared given that he was essentially learning to shoot all over again with his off eye. The misses bothered him more than they should. He analyzed each one, trying to determine if it was a fundamentals problem or a vision problem, or just the chaos of wind and mirage that made every shot a negotiation with physics. Most were attributable to trigger control. He was tensing up, anticipating the recoil, jerking the rifle just enough to throw the shot off by inches that became feet at distance. He made notes: relax grip, focus on trigger press not recoil, trust the position, let the rifle do its job. Someone knocked on his door. Ridge closed the notebook and stood, his knees protesting the movement. He opened the door to find Colonel Hargrove standing there with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. Thought you might want company, Hargrove said. Ridge stepped aside and let him in. Hargrove set the glasses on the desk and poured 2 fingers into each without asking if Ridge wanted any. They had known each other long enough that asking was unnecessary. Heard you took on Private Castillo, Hargrove said, handing Ridge a glass. You heard that fast. Small base, word travels. Hargrove sipped his bourbon. That kid is a problem, Bill, smart but angry, talented but undisciplined. I have tried 3 different NCOs with him. None of them could get through. So you thought you would dump him on me 3 weeks, before the biggest competition of my career. Hargrove smiled. I thought you might see something of yourself in him, and I thought maybe having someone to teach would help you remember why you do this. Ridge tasted the bourbon. It was good, smooth, the kind of expensive that Hargrove only broke out for serious conversations. You think I forgot why I do this? I think you are so focused on proving you are not too old that you have forgotten shooting is about more than winning. Hargrove settled into the room's single chair. You taught me that. Long time ago. Fort Bragg. I was a lieutenant. You were a sergeant. I was obsessed with scores and rankings. You told me that numbers do not mean anything if you do not understand what they represent. Ridge remembered. Hargrove had been insufferable back then. A West Point graduate convinced his degree made him superior to the NCOs who had been doing the job since before he was born. Ridge had taken him to the range and let him shoot until his shoulders ached and his ego deflated, then explained that a rifle did not care about your diploma. It only cared if you respected the craft. Castillo reminds me of you back then, Ridge said. Except instead of arrogance, it is anger. Anger is just arrogance pointed inward, Hargrove said. You teach him the same way you taught me, with patience and without judgment. Let him discover what he is capable of when someone believes in him. They drank in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, the base was settling into its evening rhythm. Soldiers heading to chow or the gym or the barracks to sleep before doing it all again tomorrow. The routine was eternal, unchanging, a comfort and a prison depending on how you looked at it. "How is Doc?" Hargrove asked quietly. Ridge set down his glass. The question had been coming. He had been preparing for it, but preparation did not make the answer any easier. "Dying," Ridge said. 6 months, maybe less." Hargrove closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. "Jesus," he whispered, "I am sorry, Bill." He does not want sorry. He wants to spot for me one more time, win one more competition, go out on his feet instead of in a hospital bed. "Then we make sure that happens," Hargrove said. "Whatever you need. Extra range time, priority equipment access. I will clear it." Ridge nodded his thanks. They finished their bourbon without talking about it further because some things were too heavy for words, and men like them had learned to carry weight in silence. When Hargrove left, Ridge lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling again. Tomorrow he would start teaching Castillo. Tomorrow he would continue retraining his left eye. Tomorrow he would wake up one day closer to retirement and one day closer to losing his best friend. But tonight, in the dark, with the bourbon warm in his stomach and the memory of the days shooting fresh in his mind, Ridge let himself imagine what it would feel like to win. To stand on that line with Doc beside him and Captain Vance's technology and all the young shooters with their confidence and their certainty, and to prove one more time that experience mattered, that patience mattered, that the old ways still worked if you trusted them enough. He imagined the feel of the trigger breaking clean, the recoil settling into his left shoulder like it belonged there, the sound of the spotter calling hit, center mass, perfect. He imagined Doc's hand on his shoulder and the weight of a life lived right pressing down like a blessing. Then he closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, and he slept without dreams, because dreams were for men who still had time to waste on things that might never come true. And Ridge had learned a long time ago that the only thing worth believing in was what you could build with your own 2 hands and hold in your sight picture until the moment you decided to let it go. Private Anthony Castillo was waiting at the range when Ridge arrived at 05:15, 15 minutes early. Which meant the kid had probably been there for half an hour. That was good. Fear was a better teacher than discipline when it came to punctuality. The young soldier stood at attention beside a bench, his M4 carbine laid out with the precision of someone who had been taught proper weapon display, but did not yet understand why it mattered. Ridge set down his rifle case and looked at the kid without saying anything. The silence stretched. Castillo started to fidget, then caught himself and went rigid again. The sun was just starting to think about coming up, painting the eastern sky that particular shade of purple that existed only in the moments before the world remembered it was supposed to be blue. "You know why you are here, Private?" Ridge finally asked. Castillo swallowed. "To learn to shoot, Sergeant." Wrong. Ridge walked over to the bench and picked up the M4. The weapon was clean, but the magazine well showed where patterns that suggested the private had been practicing his reloads obsessively, probably trying to shave tenths of seconds off his qualification times. "You already know how to shoot. That is not why you are here." He set the carbine back down and met Castillo's eyes. "You are here because you are angry, and anger without discipline gets people killed. You are here because someone saw potential in you that you have not seen in yourself yet. And you are here because I need someone to teach, and teaching keeps me sharp." Castillo processed this, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he could not quite figure out how to swallow. "Yes, Sergeant." Doc arrived a few minutes later, moving slower than yesterday, favoring his right side in a way that told Ridge the pain was getting worse. But his eyes were clear and his hands were steady, and when he set up the spotting scope, his movements had the automatic precision of a man who had done this so many times. The task existed somewhere below conscious thought. "We are starting from the beginning," Ridge told Castillo. "Forget everything you think you know about shooting. Forget qualification scores and expert badges and whatever your drill sergeants taught you about marksmanship. All of that is checklist compliance. What we are doing here is learning conversation." Castillo's confusion was visible. "Conversation, Sergeant." "A rifle is the last honest conversation left in this world," Ridge said, and the words came out exactly the way his father had spoken them 30 years ago in Montana, with the wind moving through the tall grass and the mountains watching like ancient witnesses. "When you pull that trigger, you are speaking to the universe in a language that has no room for lies or excuses. The bullet goes where physics demands. Your job is to understand that language well enough to say exactly what you mean." He picked up his own rifle and moved it to his left shoulder, the motion still unfamiliar but getting smoother with each repetition. "Watch," he said. Ridge settled into position, left eye to the scope, and began walking Castillo through his process. Not the mechanical steps of firing a rifle, but the mental discipline that turned mechanics into art. How to read mirage. How to feel wind on your face and translate that sensation into holds measured in fractions of degrees. How to control your breathing until your heartbeat became a metronome you could time your shots between. Castillo watched with the intensity of someone who had just realized he had been playing checkers when everyone else was playing chess. When Ridge finished the demonstration, putting 3 rounds into a target at 800 yards with a consistency that made the hits look easy, the private's expression had shifted from confusion to something closer to awe. "Your turn," Ridge said, stepping back from the firing line. Castillo moved forward, mimicking Ridge's position as best he could. But mimicry was not understanding, and his body was tense in all the places it should have been relaxed, loose in all the places it needed to be firm. Ridge spent the next 2 hours correcting fundamentals, breaking down 40 years of accumulated knowledge into pieces small enough for a 19-year-old brain to process. Doc spotted, calling corrections in that patient voice of his that never judged, only guided. "Left shoulder is climbing. Breathing is too shallow. Natural point of aim is off. Reset your position." They burned through ammunition and the sun climbed higher, and by the time Ridge called a break, Castillo was soaked in sweat and his groups had improved from embarrassing to merely poor. Progress was progress, even when it was measured in inches. "You are thinking too much," Ridge told him during the break. "Your brain is trying to control everything and making it worse. Shooting is not about thinking. It is about feeling, about trusting your body to do what you have trained it to do." "How do I stop thinking?" Castillo asked, and the question was genuine, stripped of the defensive sarcasm that had characterized his earlier responses. Ridge looked at Doc, who nodded slightly. The old spotter knew what was coming because they had done this before, with other young soldiers in other places, teaching the unteachable thing that separated shooters from snipers. "You stop thinking by giving yourself permission to fail," Ridge said. "Right now you are so afraid of missing that every shot is loaded with fear, and fear makes you tense. Tension destroys consistency. So here is what we are going to do. I want you to take 10 shots. I do not care where they land. I do not care if you hit or miss. I only care that each shot feels the same. Same grip pressure, same breathing rhythm, same trigger press. Can you do that?" Castillo looked uncertain but nodded. The next 10 rounds were chaos. Some hit, some missed by feet, but somewhere around shot 7 something changed. The private's shoulders dropped half an inch. His breathing evened out, and when he pressed the trigger on round 10, the motion was smooth instead of jerky, confident instead of fearful. "Better," Doc called. "That last one was textbook." Ridge saw it in Castillo's face. The moment of realization. The understanding that precision was not about force or willpower, it was about surrender, about letting go of control and trusting the process. They worked for another hour before Ridge called it. The kid was exhausted, his shirt dark with sweat, his hands shaking slightly from fatigue and adrenaline come-down. But his eyes were different now. Less angry, more focused. The transformation was beginning. "Tomorrow same time," Ridge said, "and private. Bring water, we are going to be out here longer." "Yes, Sergeant." Castillo packed his gear with noticeably more care than he had unpacked it, and when he walked away there was something straighter about his spine, something more certain about his gait. "That kid is going to be good," Doc observed. "If he stays out of fights long enough to learn," Ridge agreed. They secured the range and headed back toward the armory. The day was heating up fast, the Georgia humidity pressing down like a wet blanket. Ridge's left shoulder ached from the unfamiliar shooting position, and his eye was tired from the strain of being primary instead of backup. He needed food and ibuprofen and probably a nap, though he would not admit to needing the last one. They were halfway across the grounds when a figure stepped out from between two buildings and blocked their path. Ridge recognized the shape before the face resolved. Captain Vance, and he was not alone. Two other officers flanked him, both younger, both watching the confrontation with the eager attention of spectators at a dogfight. "Sergeant Bridger," Vance said. His voice carried that particular tone of false friendliness that Ridge had learned to distrust. "I have been looking for you." "Here I am," Ridge said flatly. "I wanted to discuss the competition." Vance stepped closer, his posture casual but his eyes calculating. "Specifically, our wager." Ridge said nothing. He had not forgotten the challenge Vance had thrown in the chow hall, but he had not taken it seriously either. Bets were for poker games and football, not for tests of skill that meant something. "I have been thinking," Vance continued, "maybe we should make this more interesting, more public, a real test of methodology, old school versus new tech, winner take all." "What exactly are you proposing, Captain?" Doc asked, his voice carrying an edge that suggested Vance was dancing closer to a line than he realized. "Simple terms." Vance smiled and Ridge recognized the expression. It was the smile of someone who thought they had already won and was just enjoying the theater of making it official. "If I win the competition using technology-assisted methods, Sergeant Bridger publicly acknowledges that his traditional techniques are obsolete and retires without protest. No appeals, no extensions, just a quiet exit." "And if I win?" Ridge asked, already knowing he should walk away but unable to quite manage it. "If you win, I resign my position as Technology Integration Officer and request transfer to a line unit. And I publicly apologize for disrespecting your methods and your service." The two young officers with Vance were grinning now, sensing blood in the water. One of them whispered something to the other and they both laughed. Ridge felt Doc tense beside him, sensed his friend preparing to step in and defuse this before it escalated into something neither of them could walk back from. But Ridge spoke first. "One addition," he said quietly. Vance raised an eyebrow. "What addition?" "Loser donates a month's salary to Wounded Warrior Project. Put some real stakes on this beyond ego." For the first time, Vance's smile flickered. He had not expected that, had not anticipated Ridge turning this into something bigger than their personal rivalry. A month's pay was serious money, especially for a captain still paying off student loans. But he had committed to the public challenge in front of witnesses, and backing down now would cost him more than money. "Deal," Vance said, extending his hand. Ridge shook it. The captain's grip was firm, competitive, trying to prove something even in this small gesture. Ridge squeezed just hard enough to be polite and released, unbothered by the posturing. "See you on the range, Captain," Ridge said, stepping around him and continuing toward the armory. Doc followed, waiting until they were out of earshot before speaking. "You just bet your career on a competition you are preparing for with an eye that is failing, and a shoulder you have been shooting with for less than a week." "I know," Ridge said. "Then why did you agree to it?" Ridge stopped walking and turned to face his friend. "Because that kid thinks technology makes him invincible, and because I need a reason to push through the doubt, and because you are dying and I need something to fight for that matters more than just proving I am not too old." Doc studied him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "You are either the bravest man I know or the dumbest. Not sure which." "Can it be both?" "Usually is," Doc admitted. They continued to the armory in silence, but Ridge could feel the weight of what he had just committed to settling onto his shoulders like a pack loaded for a long march. He had 3 weeks to rebuild 40 years of muscle memory, train a troubled private, and beat a younger shooter with equipment that cost more than Ridge's truck. The smart play would have been to decline, to walk away, to accept that some battles were not worth fighting. But Ridge had never been good at the smart play, and walking away had never been his style. That afternoon, Ridge was summoned to Colonel Hargrove's office. The message came during lunch, delivered by a private who looked nervous about interrupting a master sergeant's meal. Ridge set down his tray and followed without asking questions. When a colonel wanted to see you, speculation was a waste of time. Hargrove's office was exactly what you would expect from a man who had spent 30 years in the Army. Spartan, functional, a desk that had seen better days, filing cabinets that predated the digital age, awards and photographs on the walls that tracked a career from second lieutenant in Desert Storm to full bird colonel running one of the Army's premier training facilities. The colonel was on the phone when Ridge entered. He gestured to a chair and continued his conversation, something about budget allocations and training cycles that sounded important to whoever was on the other end but meant nothing to Ridge. Finally, Hargrove hung up and turned his attention fully to his old friend. "I heard about your bet with Captain Vance," he said without preamble. "Word travels fast," Ridge observed. "Small base. Stupid decisions travel faster." Hargrove leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "What the hell were you thinking, Bill?" "I was thinking a captain needed a lesson in humility. By betting your career, by agreeing to retire early if you lose." Hargrove's voice carried frustration but also concern, the tone of someone who cared enough to be angry. "You have given that kid exactly what he wants. A public victory that proves his point and gets rid of you in one move." Ridge met his friend's eyes. "Or I win and prove that experience and discipline still matter in a world obsessed with shortcuts and technology." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Doc told me about your eye, about switching to left-handed shooting. That is not a small thing to overcome in 3 weeks." "No," Ridge agreed, "it is not. So why take this risk? Why not just compete for the sake of competing? Why turn it into a binary outcome where you either win completely or lose everything?" Ridge thought about how to answer that. The truth was complicated, wrapped up in pride and fear and the desperate need to matter in a world that was already moving past him. But Hargrove deserved honesty, even if the honest answer was ugly. "Because I am 58 years old and my best friend is dying, and in 6 months I am going to be retired whether I want to be or not," Ridge said. "And I need to know that I still can, that I am not just a relic waiting to be put on a shelf. I need to prove to myself that the things I believe in, the things I have spent 40 years learning, still have value. And if I am wrong, if technology really has made me obsolete, Then maybe it is better to find out now and walk away clean instead of hanging around embarrassing myself. Hargrove was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sounds of the base filtered through the window, soldiers marching, vehicles moving, the constant mechanical heartbeat of a place that never truly slept. Finally, the colonel sighed and opened a drawer in his desk. He pulled out a folder and slid it across to Ridge. "What is this?" Ridge asked. "Background on Private Castillo," Hargrove said. "I figured if you are going to train him, you should know what you are working with." Ridge opened the folder. Inside were service records, disciplinary reports, psychological evaluations. He skimmed the contents, piecing together a story that was depressingly familiar. Broken home, father in prison, mother struggling with addiction. The kid had raised himself on the streets of East Los Angeles, running with gangs because gangs were the only family structure he knew. The Army had been offered as an alternative to jail time after a fight that put another teenager in the hospital. But there was more. Test scores that showed intelligence, aptitude evaluations that suggested real potential, comments from drill sergeants that noted aggression but also noted courage. This was not a bad kid. This was a kid who had never been given a reason to be good. "He reminds me of someone," Hargrove said quietly. Ridge looked up. "Who?" "You, 35 years ago. Angry Montana ranch kid who joined the Army because there was nothing else and nobody believed in you until someone took the time to show you that discipline was not punishment. It was freedom." Ridge closed the folder. "That why you assigned him to me. That is why I am giving you a chance to do for him what someone did for you." Hargrove leaned forward. "Win or lose that competition, Bill, training that kid right might be the most important thing you do this year." Ridge took the folder and stood. "Understood, sir." He was almost to the door when Hargrove spoke again. "Bill, do not lose. That smug bastard needs to learn that technology is a tool, not a religion, and I would hate to see you go out on anything but your own terms." Ridge nodded once and left, closing the door quietly behind him. That evening, Ridge found himself at the range again, alone this time, watching the sun slide toward the horizon and turn the sky into something that looked like a painting of a fire someone had tried and failed to put out. His rifle was set up, loaded, ready. The target was at 1,500 yards, far enough to be challenging, but close enough that his failing right eye could still see it if he squinted. He had come here to practice, to squeeze in extra repetitions, to build muscle memory faster through sheer volume of work. But now that he was here, he found himself just sitting, looking downrange, thinking about all the shots he had taken over 40 years and wondering how many he had left. A sound behind him made Ridge turn. Doc was walking toward him, moving carefully, one hand pressed to his side in a way that suggested the pain was bad tonight. He should have been resting, should have been saving his strength. Instead, he was here because this was what they did. They showed up for each other. "Could not sleep," Doc said, lowering himself onto the bench beside Ridge with a grimace he tried to hide. "Me neither," Ridge admitted. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light die and the shadows grow long. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out, its voice lonely and determined in the gathering dark. "You remember Fallujah?" Doc asked. 2004, that house with the sniper in the window." Ridge remembered. It had been a bad day and a bad month and a bad year. They had been pinned down, taking fire from a building they could not approach without casualties they could not afford. Ridge had set up in a bombed-out storefront and put rounds through a window 600 meters away until the enemy sniper stopped shooting back. "What about it?" Ridge asked. "Your spotter that day was sick, food poisoning or something. You had some boot lieutenant calling your shots. Kid did not know his ass from his elbow when it came to wind." Ridge nodded. He remembered that too. The lieutenant had been eager but inexperienced, calling holds that made no sense and second-guessing every correction Ridge made. You ignored him, Doc continued. Just read the Mirage yourself and made your own adjustments and put that guy down with 3 rounds. Lieutenant asked how you did it without a good spotter. You know what you told him. Ridge did not remember his exact words, but he could guess the sentiment. You told him that a good spotter makes you better, but a good shooter can make it work regardless, Doc said. You told him that tools and partners and technology are all multipliers, but at the end of the day, the only thing you can truly rely on is yourself. I remember, Ridge said quietly. Good, Doc said, because that is what is going to win this competition. Not me spotting, though I will do my best. Not that kid Castillo, though he might surprise you. Just you. Your eyes, your hands, your judgment. 40 years of accumulated skill that lives in your bones. He stood up slowly, the movement clearly painful. I am going to bed, he said, but I wanted you to hear that before Friday. Vance has all the fancy equipment in the world, but he does not have what you have. He does not have the scar tissue, the failures that taught you more than the successes ever could, the 10,000 repetitions that turned conscious thought into unconscious reflex. Doc put a hand on Ridge's shoulder. You are going to win, Bill, not because you are better than him, but because you know something he has not learned yet. That shooting is not about controlling the rifle. It is about becoming the rifle. Then he walked away, leaving Ridge alone with the sunset and the rifle and the weight of expectations he was not sure he could carry. Ridge sat there until the stars came out and the range lights clicked on with their harsh fluorescent glow. Then he stood, packed his gear, and walked back to his quarters through a base that was settling into its evening rhythm. Tomorrow he would train Castillo again. Tomorrow he would practice his left eye shooting. Tomorrow he would move one day closer to the competition, and one day closer to finding out if 40 years of experience could beat 3 weeks of desperation. But tonight he allowed himself a moment of doubt, allowed himself to feel the fear that he usually kept locked away behind discipline and routine, fear that he was not good enough anymore, fear that his body was betraying him, fear that Doc would not make it to see the competition, fear that he would lose and prove everyone right who had ever said he was too old, too stubborn, too attached to methods that the modern world had moved beyond. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the photograph of his son, still face down on the desk where he had left it days ago. His hand hovered over it, hesitated, then turned it face up. James stared back at him with those young eyes full of certainty and anger, and all the things that get you killed when you are 26 and convinced you are immortal. Ridge had not been there when his son died, had not been able to say goodbye or offer comfort or tell him that the distance between them had been Ridge's fault, not James's. The notification had come via satellite phone in a dusty Iraqi firebase, and Ridge had received it alone and dealt with it alone and buried it alone because that was what soldiers did. But sitting here now, 3 weeks from a competition that felt like his last stand, Ridge let himself wonder what James would think, whether his son would be proud or disappointed, whether the old man obsessed with proving himself one more time was admirable or just pathetic. He did not have an answer. The dead did not speak, no matter how much you wanted them to. Ridge set the photograph back down, picture side against the desk, and lay back on the bed fully clothed. Sleep would not come easy tonight. It never did when the stakes were high and the outcome was uncertain. But he closed his eyes anyway and let his mind drift, and somewhere in the space between awake and asleep, he felt his father's hand on his shoulder and heard his son's voice telling him that it was okay to be afraid, as long as fear did not stop you from moving forward. And Ridge held onto that feeling, fragile as it was, and let it carry him into dreams where his eyes still worked, and his body did not hurt, and the people he loved were still alive to see him succeed or fail with equal grace. The morning of the competition arrived wearing the face of every important day Ridge had ever lived through. Clear sky, still air that would not stay still for long. The kind of silence that existed only in the hour before men gathered to test themselves against distance and doubt, and each other. Ridge was awake at 0400, but he had not really slept. His body had gone through the motions of rest, while his mind ran endless calculations, imagining wind patterns and mirage distortions, and all the thousand small variables that could turn a perfect shot into a miss measured in inches that felt like miles. He lay in the dark and listened to his heartbeat, and wondered if this was how gladiators felt the night before the arena, knowing that tomorrow would either validate everything they believed about themselves or destroy it completely. By 0500 he was dressed and moving through the empty barracks toward the armory. His left shoulder ached with a deep bruised pain that spoke of 3 weeks of punishment, of thousands of rounds fired from an unfamiliar position, of muscle and tendon and bone adapting to demands they had never been asked to meet before. The ache was good. Pain meant he had done the work. Pain meant his body was changing. The armory was unlocked when he arrived, which meant Doc was already there. Ridge found his friend sitting on a bench in the half-light of emergency exit signs, the spotting scope disassembled in front of him, each component laid out with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation that would determine whether the patient lived or died. Doc did not look up when Ridge entered. His hands moved over the glass and the mounts and the adjustment knobs with a tenderness that was almost religious. This scope had been with them through 4 wars and a dozen countries and situations, where the difference between seeing clearly and seeing wrong was measured in body bags. It was as much a part of their partnership as trust or training, or the unspoken understanding that came from 20 years of watching each other's backs. "How long have you been here?" Ridge asked quietly. Doc shrugged without looking up. "Long enough to check everything twice. Going to check it twice more before we leave." Ridge understood. This was how his friend dealt with the waiting, with the knowledge that his body was failing him but his skills were not, with the fear that he might not be able to spot clearly when it mattered most. Doc could not control the cancer eating him from inside, but he could control whether every lens was perfectly clean and every adjustment was precisely calibrated. Ridge set down his rifle case and began his own ritual. He had cleaned the weapon last night, but he cleaned it again now because ritual mattered more than necessity. The act of disassembly and inspection and reassembly was a conversation with the tool that would either save his career or end it. The rifle did not care about his problems, but it would respond honestly to how well he had prepared it. They worked in silence for 30 minutes. Outside, the base was starting to wake up. Voices carried through the walls. Vehicles started. The world was remembering it had jobs to do and places to be. But in the armory, time moved differently. Slower, more deliberately, with the weight of consequence pressing down on every small action. Private Castillo arrived at 0545 early again, and Ridge felt something like pride move through his chest. The kid was learning, not just about shooting, but about showing up, about being reliable when reliability was the only currency that mattered. Castillo had his M4 with him, but Ridge had told him yesterday that he would not be shooting today. His job was to observe, to watch how competition was conducted at the highest level, to see what it looked like when men who had spent decades perfecting their craft put everything on the line in front of an audience that would remember their failures longer than their successes. The kid set down his gear and stood quietly, sensing that this was not a time for questions or conversation. His eyes moved between Ridge and Doc, watching the old warriors prepare their equipment with a care that bordered on reverence, and Ridge could see understanding forming in the young soldier's face. This was not sport. This was not entertainment. This was validation. This was purpose. This was two men near the end of their service, trying to prove one more time that the things they had given their lives to still mattered. Colonel Hargrove arrived at 0600 with coffee in paper cups and an expression that said he had not slept much either. He handed Ridge a cup without comment, then gave one to Doc, then kept one for himself. They stood there drinking bitter coffee that was too hot and too weak and exactly what they needed, bound together by decades of shared history and the understanding that today would change things regardless of the outcome. "The range brief is at 0700, Hargrove said finally. "First relay shoots at 0800. You are in the third relay, scheduled for 10:30. 50 shooters total. Format is best of 5 rounds at 2,400 yards. Smallest group wins. Wind is supposed to pick up around noon, so you might catch it before it gets too chaotic." Ridge nodded. 2,400 yards, just over a mile and a third. Far enough that the bullet would be in flight for nearly 3 seconds. Far enough that wind could push it 6 feet in any direction if you misjudged the hold. Far enough that every tiny error in fundamentals would be magnified into failure. "Vance is shooting in the second relay," Hargrove continued, "at 0900. His team has been on the range since 0500 setting up their equipment. Full weather station, ballistic computer, the works." "Let him have his toys," Doc muttered. "We have got something better." "What is that?" Castillo asked quietly. "Experience," Doc said, and the single word carried the weight of 10,000 shots fired and lessons learned and mistakes paid for in blood. They finished their coffee and loaded the gear into Hargrove's truck. The colonel drove them to the competition range on the far side of the base, where the distances were long enough to be meaningful, and the berms were high enough to stop rounds that wanted to keep traveling into the next county. The sun was up now, painting everything in that harsh morning light that made shadows sharp and colors too bright. The parking area was already filling with vehicles. Shooters from every branch of service were arriving with their equipment and their support teams and the particular swagger that came from men who were very good at a very specific thing. Ridge saw Marine Scout snipers in their Desert Digital, Navy SEALs in their subdued uniforms, Air Force pararescuemen who could shoot well enough to protect pilots in hostile territory, Army Rangers and Special Forces and conventional infantry who had qualified expert and then kept going until expert was no longer impressive. This was the best of the best, gathered in one place to determine who was the best of the best of the best. And Ridge was about to walk into their midst as a 58-year-old supply sergeant with failing eyes and a shoulder he had been shooting with for less than a month. He climbed out of the truck and felt the weight of doubt try to settle on his shoulders again. He shrugged it off with an effort that would have been easier 30 years ago. The range brief was held in a large tent that had been set up overnight. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a podium where a full Colonel Ridge did not recognize was going through the rules and safety procedures with the enthusiasm of a man who had given this same brief 100 times and expected to give it 100 more. Ridge found a seat in the back next to Doc and Castillo and half listened, while his mind ran through his pre-shot routine for the 1,000th time. The format was simple: 5 rounds. Best group measured from center to center of the 2 widest impacts. Smallest group wins. Ties would be broken by smallest single deviation from dead center. No sighters allowed on the record target. You got the rounds you got and you made them count, or you went home with nothing but the memory of failure. When the brief ended, shooters began moving to their assigned firing points. The range had 10 positions, which meant 5 relays of 10 shooters each. Ridge watched the first relay with the detached interest of a professional studying the competition. Most were good. A few were exceptional. One Marine put all 5 rounds into a group that could be covered by a dinner plate at 2,400 yards, and the crowd murmured with appreciation. Then the second relay was called. Captain Derek Vance stood from his seat 3 rows ahead of Ridge and walked toward the firing line with his support team, trailing behind like priests attending a high mass. Ridge watched him set up his position. The custom rifle on its expensive bipod, the ballistic computer mounted and glowing, the weather station feeding real-time data into algorithms that would calculate the perfect hold for current conditions. It was impressive. Ridge could admit that. The technology was light years beyond what had existed when he learned to shoot. The computer could factor in variables that Ridge had to estimate or ignore completely. Spin drift, Coriolis effect, density-altitude changes, temperature gradients at different distances, all of it processed in seconds and displayed as a simple number. Hold this much. Dial this elevation. Send round. Vance settled into position with the smooth confidence of someone who had done this before and expected to do it perfectly. His spotter called the data from the computer. Elevation 26.4 mils, windage 3.2 mils right, temperature 73 degrees, density altitude 2,800 feet. Vance dialed his scope and sent his first round. The spotters called it immediately. Hit, right edge, 6 inches from center. Ridge watched Vance's face through binoculars. The captain frowned slightly. 6 inches was good at this distance, but not exceptional, not winning material. The computer should have been more accurate. Vance made a small adjustment and sent his second round. Hit, left edge, 4 inches from center. Better, but now he had a spread of 10 inches between his first and second shot. The group was opening up. The problem, Ridge realized, was that Vance was trusting the computer completely. He was not reading the mirage, not feeling the wind on his face, not using his own judgment to verify what the sensors were telling him. He was outsourcing his expertise to a machine, and the machine was good but not perfect because machines could not account for every variable, could not sense the small thermal currents that created micro-wind patterns, could not see the mirage distortions that spoke of air density, changes the sensors had not registered yet. Vance fired his remaining 3 rounds with increasing frustration. The group grew to 14 inches, which was respectable but not dominant. When he stood and cleared his rifle, his jaw was tight and his movements were sharp with barely contained anger. The technology had not delivered the miracle he expected. Ridge felt no satisfaction in watching Vance struggle, only a quiet confirmation of what he had always known. Tools were useful, training was essential, but at the end of the day, shooting was about human judgment and human instinct, and the accumulated wisdom that came from doing something 10,000 times until it lived in your bones. The third relay was called. Ridge stood and felt his knees protest and his back complain, and all the other small pains that came from being almost 60, and asking his body to perform like it was still 30. Doc stood beside him, moving slowly, one hand pressed briefly to his ribs in a gesture that told Ridge the pain was bad today, but Doc was managing it because managing it was all he could do. They walked to the firing line together. Ridge carried his rifle. Doc carried the spotting scope. Castillo carried their gear bag and water, and the weight of being witness to something he was just beginning to understand was important beyond the mechanics of the competition itself. Position 7 was theirs. Ridge set up his rifle while Doc assembled the spotting scope. Around them, the other shooters in the relay were doing the same. Some were young like Vance, confident in technology or training or talent. Others were older like Ridge, veterans who had been doing this since before half the crowd was born. All of them were good. All of them had earned the right to be here. The range officer called out the commands that would govern the next 30 minutes. Shooters make ready, load and lock, assume firing position. The words were formal and military and utterly familiar to Ridge. He had heard them in a dozen languages across a dozen countries, and they always meant the same thing: time to prove yourself, time to deliver, time to find out if all the preparation and all the practice and all the belief in yourself was justified, or just delusion wearing the mask of confidence. Ridge settled into position, left shoulder, left eye. The stock found its place against his cheek like it had been molded there. His breathing slowed automatically, a conditioned response built from 40 years of repetition. Through the scope, the target appeared sharp and clear and impossibly small at 2,400 yards, a circle of steel 16 inches in diameter, barely visible in the mirage that was already starting to rise from the heated ground. Doc settled behind the spotting scope and began his assessment. Wind is 8 to 10 miles per hour, quartering from 7 o'clock. Mirage is moderate boil at 1,200 yards, thinner beyond that. Temperature climbing. You are going to need to account for the density-altitude change between now and your last round. Ridge processed this information without thinking about it. His brain translated Doc's observations into holds and adjustments and timing windows with the automatic efficiency of a computer, except this computer ran on experience instead of algorithms. "First shot is yours," Doc said quietly. "Send when ready." Ridge found his natural point of aim, the position where the rifle wanted to point without muscular effort. He checked his bubble level to ensure the scope was not canted. He noted the wind flags at 600 yards and 1,200 yards and 1,800 yards, reading the story they told about what the air was doing along the bullet's path. He felt the wind on his left cheek, a gentle pressure that confirmed what the flags were saying. Then he began his count, the internal metronome that timed his breathing and his heartbeat, and the moment when the world stopped moving long enough for a bullet to fly true. 1. Inhale slowly through the nose. 2. Exhale halfway, letting the lungs settle into the pause. 3. Finger moving to the trigger, taking up the slack. 4. Crosshairs settling on the target, steady as stone. 5. The space between heartbeats where nothing exists but intention. 6. Pressure increasing on the trigger, smooth and inevitable. 7. The break. The rifle spoke. The sound was sharp and clean and honest. Ridge rode the recoil, his shoulder absorbing the impact, his eye staying on target through the scope to see where the shot would land. The spotting scope was faster than his naked eye could track, and Doc called it almost before the sound of the report faded. Hit center mass, 2 inches high, 1 inch right, good first round. Ridge worked the bolt left-handed, the motion smoother now than it had been 3 weeks ago. The brass ejected and fell to the mat with a sound like a coin dropping into an offering plate. He chambered the second round and settled again. This time he adjusted his point of aim slightly, compensating for the deviation Doc had called. The wind was still consistent. The mirage was still readable. Everything was operating within expected parameters. Ridge began his count again. On 7, the trigger broke. On 8, Doc called the hit. Dead center, perfect. Ridge allowed himself the smallest moment of satisfaction before clearing it from his mind. 2 rounds down, 3 to go. The group was tight so far, maybe 3 inches total spread, but the wind was rising. He could feel it building, the pressure on his face increasing, the flag starting to dance instead of just lean. 3rd round. Ridge adjusted his hold to account for the increasing wind. Doc confirmed the correction with a quiet affirmative. The trigger broke clean. The recoil was familiar now, comfortable, almost welcome. Hit 1 inch left of center, still tight. 4th round. The wind was definitely stronger now, gusting to 12 miles per hour, and the mirage at 1,200 yards was starting to boil hard enough to blur the image. Ridge had to make a judgment call. Trust the mirage distortion or trust the flags. They were telling him slightly different things, and the computer that was his brain had to integrate both sources and make a decision in the second or two he had before the window closed. He chose to trust the mirage, held an extra half-mil into the wind, sent the round. Hit 2 inches right of center. Ridge felt the group opening up. 4 rounds in a 6-inch spread, which was good but might not be good enough. The Marine from the first relay had shot a 5-inch group. Ridge needed his last round to stay inside that or he would lose. Doc must have sensed his tension, because the old spotter's voice came through calm and steady. The same voice that had talked Ridge through firefights and bad weather and moments when doubt had tried to overwhelm discipline. "Bill," Doc said quietly, "forget the competition, forget Vance, forget everything except this one shot. You have done this 10,000 times, you know what to do, trust yourself." Ridge took a breath, let it out, took another one. The world narrowed until it fit inside the circle of his scope and the space between his heartbeats. He read the mirage one more time, felt the wind, checked his natural point of aim. Then he began his count for the last time. On 7, his finger increased pressure on the trigger. On 8, the rifle fired. On 9, Doc called the shot. Dead center, perfect. Ridge safed his rifle and sat up from the firing position. His shoulder throbbed, his eye ached, his back was stiff from being prone for 30 minutes, but he had done it. 5 rounds in a 5.2-inch group at 2,400 yards, better than the Marine, better than anyone else he had seen shoot so far. The question was whether it was better than Vance. They packed up the gear and walked back to the waiting area while the 4th relay took their positions. Ridge did not watch them shoot. There was no point. Either his group would hold up or it would not. Obsessing over what other people were doing was just another form of doubt, and doubt served no purpose now. Colonel Hargrove found them in the shade of the tent and handed Ridge a bottle of water without speaking. Ridge drank half of it in one pull, his body suddenly aware of how dehydrated he was. Doc sat on a folding chair and closed his eyes, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. The effort of spotting had cost him more than he wanted to admit. Castillo stood nearby, his eyes wide, his expression caught between awe and understanding. He had just watched what mastery looked like under pressure, had seen 2 old men execute their craft with a precision that technology could not match and youth could not replicate. The lesson was being absorbed even if the kid could not articulate it yet. The 4th relay finished. The 5th relay shot. Ridge watched the scores being posted on the board near the command tent. His group was holding at number 1. The Marine was number 2. Vance was number 7. As each new score went up, Ridge allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was actually going to win this. Then the final shooter of the 5th relay stood up and walked to the scoring table with a confidence that made Ridge's stomach tighten. The score went up, 4.8 inches, better than Ridge by 0.4 of an inch. Ridge felt the victory slip away like water through his fingers. He had shot the best group of his life with his off eye and his weak shoulder, and it was not enough. 2nd place. Close but not close enough. The story of every competition he had ever lost. Doc opened his eyes and saw the board, saw Ridge's face, reached over and gripped his friend's arm with a strength that should not have been possible for someone so sick. "You did not lose to technology, Bill," Doc said quietly. "You lost to another shooter having a better day. That is how it is supposed to work. And you still beat 48 other people, including that smug captain who thought his computer made him invincible." Ridge nodded because words were not available. He stood and walked toward the command tent where the awards ceremony would take place. 2nd was not 1st, but it was not failure either. He had proven he could still shoot, had proven that his methods still worked, had proven that 58 was not too old to compete at the highest level. But the public bet with Vance, the terms had been winner take all. Ridge had not won. He was halfway to the tent when Colonel Hargrove appeared beside him with an expression Ridge could not read. "Bill," he said, "come with me. There is something you need to see." Hargrove led Ridge to the scoring table where 3 judges were examining targets with magnifying glasses and measuring devices. One of them looked up as Ridge approached. "Sergeant Bridger," the judge said, "we need to make an official verification on the winning target. Standard procedure for close competitions. Would you mind witnessing?" Ridge nodded, confused. The judge laid out the winning target next to Ridge's target. Both had 5 holes. Both looked tight. The judge pulled out calipers and began measuring the distance between the widest 2 impacts on each target. The other shooter's group, 4.8 inches center to center. Then Ridge's group. The judge measured once, frowned, measured again, looked at the other 2 judges who both nodded confirmation. "Sergeant Bridger, your group measures 4.7 inches center to center. You are the winner." The words did not make sense at first. Ridge stared at the targets, at the tiny difference that separated victory from defeat. 1/10 of an inch. At 2,400 yards, the width of a pencil line. The margin of error was so small it could have been measurement variance or wind shift or 1,000 other factors that had nothing to do with skill. But it was enough. "You won," Hargrove said quietly. "By 1/10 of an inch you won." Ridge turned and found Doc standing behind him, leaning heavily on Castillo's shoulder but grinning with a fierce joy that made him look 10 years younger. The old spotter raised one fist in the air, a gesture of triumph that was also a goodbye, a final victory before the darkness came. And Ridge understood. This was not just about beating Vance. This was not just about proving his method still worked. This was about giving Doc one last win, one last perfect day on the range, one last moment where they were young again and invincible and the best at what they did. Captain Vance appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable. He walked over to Ridge and stood there for a moment, processing defeat. Then he extended his hand. "Congratulations, Sergeant Bridger," Vance said. His voice was tight but sincere. "That was extraordinary shooting." Ridge shook his hand. "You shot well too, Captain. 14 inches at this distance is nothing to be ashamed of." Vance nodded slowly. "I learned something today," he said. "Technology is a tool, not a substitute for skill. My computer gave me data. You read the conditions with 40 years of experience. Experience 1. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his captain's bars. "As per our agreement, I resign my position as Technology Integration Officer. I will submit a transfer request tomorrow." Ridge looked at the bars, at the young officer who had learned humility the hard way, at the lesson that had cost both of them more than they expected. Then he shook his head. "Keep your position, Captain," Ridge said. "Keep your bars. The bet was about ego, and ego does not teach anyone anything worth knowing. What I want instead is for you to work with me. Combine your technology with my experience. Teach the next generation both ways so they are not dependent on either one." Vance stared at him, surprise and relief and respect all fighting for control of his expression. "You do not have to do that, Sergeant." "I know," Ridge said, "but I am doing it anyway. Because winning without teaching something is just collecting trophies, and I am too old for trophies." Vance smiled, genuine this time, and Ridge saw what the kid could become with a little humility and a lot more seasoning. They shook hands again, and this time it was not a bet being sealed. It was a partnership being born. The awards ceremony was brief and military, and exactly what Ridge expected. They handed him a plaque and a check, and a slot at the international competition that he would probably decline because one victory was enough. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. People who had ignored him 3 weeks ago now wanted to shake his hand and hear his story. Ridge endured it with the patience of someone who understood that this part was just theater. The real victory had happened on the firing line with Doc beside him and Castillo watching, and the rifle speaking truth that no amount of ceremony could improve. When it was over, Ridge found Doc sitting in Hargrove's truck with his eyes closed and his breathing shallow. The effort of the day had taken everything he had left. Ridge climbed in beside him and sat in silence while Castillo loaded the gear and Hargrove started the engine. "We did it," Doc whispered without opening his eyes. "We did," Ridge agreed. "One more win before I go." "One more," Ridge confirmed, his throat tight. Doc smiled, a small private thing that belonged only to them. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Ridge with a clarity that was heartbreaking in its certainty. "Thank you, Bill, for letting me be part of this, for letting me spot one last time, for giving me a reason to hold on long enough to see you win." Ridge could not speak, could only nod and grip his friend's hand, and hold on while Hargrove drove them back across the base through a Georgia afternoon that was entirely too beautiful for the grief that was gathering in Ridge's chest like a storm that had not broken yet but would soon enough. That night, Doc collapsed. They rushed him to the hospital where doctors who had seen this before gave Hargrove and Ridge the look that meant hours, not days. Ridge sat beside the bed and held his friend's hand and watched the machines measure out the final moments of a life that had mattered more than awards or accolades or any recognition the Army could ever give. Doc died at 02:15, with Ridge holding his hand and Castillo standing vigil in the corner and Hargrove making the calls that would set the machinery of military death in motion. He died quietly, without drama, the way he had lived. And Ridge sat there long after the monitors went silent, unable to let go, unable to accept that the person who had known him longest and best was gone. Finally, Castillo put a hand on Ridge's shoulder. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "we have to let them take him now." Ridge released Doc's hand and stood. His body felt old and heavy and wrong, like all the years he had been holding at bay with discipline and routine had suddenly caught up to him. He walked out of the hospital into a night that was entirely too quiet and entirely too dark, and he understood that some victories cost more than you expected to pay, and winning did not make the grief hurt any less. The funeral was held on a Tuesday morning when the sky could not decide if it wanted to rain or just threatened to. Fort Bennink's main cemetery sat on a hill that overlooked the training ranges where Doc had spent the better part of 3 decades teaching young soldiers how to see what most people only looked at. The irony was not lost on Ridge. His friend would spend eternity listening to rifle fire and wind moving through grass, the same sounds that had defined his life. They buried Marcus Holliday with full military honors. A flag-draped casket, a honor guard that moved with the precision of men who had practiced this ceremony too many times, a chaplain who spoke words about service and sacrifice that were true but insufficient because words could never capture what Doc had been to the people who knew him. Ridge stood at attention in his dress uniform and watched them fold the flag into the triangle that represented a grateful nation's acknowledgement of debt. They handed it to him because Doc had no living family, no wife or children or siblings who had survived long enough to receive it. Ridge was the closest thing to family the old spotter had, and as he took the flag and felt its weight in his hands, he understood that he was holding the physical manifestation of a life lived in service to something larger than self. The rifle volley cracked across the cemetery. 21 shots fired in 3 volleys of 7, and with each report Ridge felt something break inside him a little more. These were the last shots that would be fired in Doc's honor. After today, the world would move on. Other soldiers would die. Other funerals would be held. And Marcus Holliday would become a name on a headstone that fewer and fewer people would visit until eventually no one remembered him at all. Taps played. The bugler was young, maybe 20, and his tone was clear and mournful and perfect. Ridge had heard taps at 100 funerals over 40 years, but it had never hurt quite like this. The notes hung in the air like grief made audible, and Ridge stood there with the flag in his hands and tears running down his face that he did not bother to hide, because there was no shame in mourning a friend who had earned every tear. When it was over, people approached Ridge to offer condolences. Colonel Hargrove gripped his shoulder and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Captain Vance shook his hand and said Doc had been an inspiration, which was true but did not help. Private Castillo stood at a distance, uncertain if he had earned the right to intrude on grief this profound, and Ridge waved him over because the kid needed to understand that honoring the dead was not about rights, it was about showing up. They stood there together, the old sergeant and the young private, looking at the fresh grave and the flowers that would wilt in a few days, and the headstone that would weather over decades until the engraved letters were smooth and unreadable. Ridge held the flag and Castillo stood beside him, and neither of them spoke, because some moments existed beyond language. Eventually, the cemetery emptied. The honor guard departed. The other mourners drifted away to resume their lives. Ridge stood there alone with the flag and the silence and the knowledge that he had lost the last person who truly understood him. Doc had been more than a spotter, more than a friend. He had been the mirror Ridge used to see himself clearly, and now that mirror was gone and Ridge was not sure who he would see when he looked inward anymore. The rain started finally, a soft drizzle that felt like the sky crying because Ridge had run out of tears. He turned and walked back to Hargrove's truck where the colonel was waiting with the heater running and the radio off because some drives required silence. They drove back to the barracks without speaking. Hargrove pulled up to Ridge's building and put the truck in park but did not turn off the engine. "Bill," he said quietly, "take some time, take as much as you need. The competition win bought you whatever you want. You can defer retirement, you can teach, you can do nothing. Just tell me what you need." Ridge looked down at the flag in his lap. "What I need is to not feel like I just buried the best part of my life," he said. "But since that is not available, I will settle for work. Give me a class. Give me students. Give me something to do that matters." Hargrove nodded slowly. "I can do that. But Bill, do not bury yourself in work because you are afraid to grieve. Doc would not want that." Ridge climbed out of the truck with the flag held carefully against his chest. "Doc would want me to teach," he said. "So that is what I am going to do." He walked into his quarters and set the flag on the desk next to the photograph of his son. 2 triangles now. 2 lives that had ended too soon. 2 reminders that the people you loved did not stay forever no matter how much you needed them to. Ridge sat on the edge of his bed and looked at both flags and both losses, and felt the weight of being the one left behind pressing down on him like gravity had doubled. He was 58 years old. His best friend was dead. His son had been dead for 13 years. His eyes were failing. His body hurt in places that would never stop hurting. And he had another 6 months until mandatory retirement sent him out into a civilian world he no longer understood or fit into. The smart thing would be to quit, to accept the retirement, to take his pension and find some quiet place where old soldiers went a fade away with dignity. The smart thing would be to acknowledge that his time was over and the next generation was ready to take his place. But Ridge had never been good at the smart thing. He stood and changed out of his dress uniform into his work uniform. He cleaned his rifle even though it was already clean. He organized his gear even though it was already organized. He did all the small rituals that kept him grounded because the alternative was sitting still and thinking led to places he was not ready to go yet. Someone knocked on his door. Ridge opened it to find Private Castillo standing there with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that said the kid had spent the last hour working up the courage to come here. "Thought you might want company," Castillo said quietly. "Or coffee, or both." Ridge stepped aside and let him in. They sat in the small room with their coffee and did not talk about the funeral because talking about it would not change anything. Instead, Castillo asked questions about shooting, about wind reading and mirage interpretation and all the technical details that Ridge had been teaching him over the past 3 weeks. And Ridge answered because teaching was easier than mourning and purpose was easier than pain. 2 hours later, Castillo left with a notebook full of information and Ridge sat alone again but feeling slightly less empty. The kid was learning, growing, becoming something better than what he had been. And maybe that was what legacy meant. Not monuments or medals or competitions won, just the quiet transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. Seeds planted in soil you would never see bear fruit. The next morning, Ridge reported to Colonel Hargrove's office at 0800. The colonel was on the phone but gestured for Ridge to sit. Ridge waited, studying the photographs on the wall that tracked Hargrove's career from nervous lieutenant to seasoned commander. In one of the older photos, Ridge could see himself in the background, younger and harder and certain about things he had since learned to doubt. Hargrove hung up and turned his attention to Ridge. "I have your next assignment," he said, "if you want it." Ridge waited. "The marksmanship unit needs a new chief instructor," Hargrove continued. "Doc's position. The job is yours if you take it. 2-year extension on your retirement date. Full authority over curriculum and instruction. You would be training the trainers, the people who go out and teach everyone else." Ridge felt something shift in his chest. Doc's position. The job his friend had held for 15 years. The role that had defined Doc's later career and given him purpose even as his body failed him. Taking it felt like both an honor and a theft, like Ridge was claiming something that still belonged to someone else. "I cannot replace him," Ridge said quietly. "I am not asking you to replace him," Hargrove replied. "I am asking you to continue what he started. Doc built a program that produces the best spotters in the military. Now I need someone who understands that program to keep it going. And more than that, I need someone who can integrate Vance's technology work with traditional methods. Create something new that honors the old." Ridge thought about Doc spotting for him one last time. Thought about the old warrior's final words. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." Thought about what his friend would say if he were here now, and the answer was obvious. Doc would tell him to stop being sentimental and get to work because work was how you honored the dead. "I will take it," Ridge said. "Good," Hargrove replied. "You start Monday. First task is to work with Captain Vance on the new integrated training program. Second task is to mentor Private Castillo. The kid has potential, but he needs guidance. Third task is to figure out what you want your legacy to be, because 2 years goes by faster than you think." Ridge nodded and stood to leave. He was at the door when Hargrove spoke again. "Bill, Doc was proud of you. He told me the night before he died. Said you were the best shooter and the best friend he ever had. I thought you should know that." Ridge's throat tightened. He nodded once and left before the emotion could overwhelm him. The weekend passed in a blur of paperwork and planning. Ridge met with Vance on Saturday to discuss the integrated training program. The captain arrived with a laptop and a presentation, but Ridge stopped him before he could start. "Put the computer away," Ridge said. "We are going to do this the old way first. Talk it through. Figure out what we are trying to accomplish before we worry about how to accomplish it." Vance looked uncertain but closed his laptop. What are we trying to accomplish, Sergeant? Ridge leaned back in his chair. We are trying to produce soldiers who can shoot accurately in any condition with any equipment. Soldiers who understand both the technology and the fundamentals. Soldiers who can adapt when the technology fails, which it always does eventually. Vance nodded slowly. So we teach both methods, traditional wind reading and ballistic computers, manual adjustments and digital solutions. Give them the full toolkit. Exactly, Ridge said. But we teach traditional methods first. Make sure they can do it without the computer before they start relying on the computer. Because the technology is only as good as the person using it, and if they do not understand the fundamentals, they will not know when the computer is wrong. They spent 4 hours that day mapping out a curriculum that blended old and new. Vance contributed his expertise on modern systems. Ridge contributed 4 decades of hard-won knowledge about what actually worked under pressure. By the end, they had the skeleton of a training program that neither of them could have built alone, but together looked like it might actually produce the kind of soldiers the future needed. As Vance packed up his gear to leave, he paused. "Sergeant Bridger, I wanted to say something. About the competition. About Doc." Ridge waited. "I was wrong to challenge you the way I did," Vance said. "It was arrogant and disrespectful. And watching you shoot that day, watching you and Doc work together, I realized something. Technology gives you data. Experience gives you wisdom. And wisdom is what wins when everything else fails." He extended his hand. "I would be honored to learn from you, Sergeant. Not just about shooting, about leadership, about what it means to serve with integrity." Ridge shook his hand. "Just show up and work hard, Captain. That is all anyone can ask." Monday morning arrived with the particular weight of new beginnings. Ridge stood in front of his first class as chief instructor, looking at 20 students who ranged from nervous privates to confident sergeants who thought they already knew everything. The room was the same one where Doc had taught for 15 years, and Ridge could feel his friend's presence in the worn floor, and the faded targets on the walls, and the particular smell of gun, oil, and coffee that defined places where serious work happened. He did not start with introductions or icebreakers or any of the modern teaching techniques that were supposed to make students comfortable. Instead, he walked to the whiteboard and wrote 2 words: precision, purpose. "These are the only 2 things that matter," Ridge said, turning to face the class. "Precision is your ability to put the round where you intend it to go. Purpose is your understanding of why you are putting it there. Everything else is just details." He spent the next hour laying out the philosophy that would govern their training. Not just the mechanics of shooting, but the mindset, the discipline, the patience, the acceptance that becoming truly skilled at anything required you to fail more times than you succeeded, until failure taught you everything success could not. One of the students, a cocky corporal with a Ranger tab, raised his hand. "Sergeant, I have been shooting for 6 years. I am already qualified expert. What can you teach me that I do not already know?" Ridge looked at him without anger or judgment. "Come up here, Corporal." The soldier walked to the front of the room, confident until he saw Ridge's expression and realized he had just volunteered for an object lesson. "You are qualified expert," Ridge said. "That means you can hit a static target at known distances in controlled conditions when someone tells you the range and the wind. That is checklist compliance. What I am going to teach you is how to hit a moving target at unknown distance in bad weather with bad equipment when you are tired and scared and everything is going wrong. That is the difference between qualifying and mastering." He turned to the rest of the class. "All of you are here because you are good. Some of you are very good, but good is not the same as ready, and ready is what I am going to make you if you trust the process and do the work." Over the following weeks, Ridge discovered that teaching was not just about transferring knowledge. It was about transformation, about taking soldiers who thought they understood shooting and breaking down their assumptions and rebuilding them into something stronger. It was hard work, frustrating work, work that required patience Ridge did not always have and compassion he had to consciously choose because his default was hard discipline. But it was also meaningful work. Every time a student finally understood a concept they had been struggling with, Ridge felt a small piece of the grief over losing Doc E's slightly. Every time someone improved their group size or made a shot they did not think was possible, Ridge felt like he was honoring his friend's memory by continuing the work they had done together. Private Castillo was in the class, the youngest student by 3 years and the most improved by every metric that mattered. The kid who had been angry and undisciplined 6 weeks ago was now focused and hungry to learn. He asked questions. He practiced on his own time. He helped other students who were struggling because Ridge had taught him that real strength was lifting others up, not standing on them. One afternoon after class, Castillo approached Ridge with a question that had nothing to do with shooting. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "how do you keep going when you lose someone important?" Ridge set down the equipment he was packing and gave the question the consideration it deserved. He knew Castillo was not just asking about Doc. The kid's file had mentioned a brother killed in a gang shooting when Castillo was 15. This was about grief that had been buried but never processed. "You do not keep going," Ridge said finally. "You just go, one foot in front of the other, one day at a time. You do your job because your job does not care about your feelings, and eventually the going becomes easier, not because the grief goes away, but because you learn to carry it without letting it carry you." Castillo nodded slowly, processing this. "Did it get easier after your son died?" Ridge felt the question hit him in the chest. No one had asked him that in years, and the honest answer was complicated. "No," he said, "it did not get easier. It got different. I learned to live with the hole he left. I learned to honor his memory by being the kind of man he could have been proud of even if he died angry at me. But easier? No. You do not get over losing a child. You just learn to function around the pain." The kid's eyes were wet. "Thank you, Sergeant, for being honest." Ridge put a hand on Castillo's shoulder. "You are going to be fine, Private. You are doing the work. You are showing up. That is all anyone can do." 2 months after Doc's funeral, Ridge was called to Colonel Hargrove's office again. This time, Hargrove had company. A general Ridge did not recognize sat in one of the visitor chairs, 2 stars on his collar, and an expression that said he was used to people standing when he entered a room. Ridge came to attention. Hargrove waved him at ease. "Master Sergeant Bridger, this is Major General Keating from Army Materiel Command. He has a proposal for you." The general stood and shook Ridge's hand with a grip that was firm without being competitive. "Sergeant Bridger, I have been following your career with interest, particularly your recent competition win and your work integrating traditional marksmanship with modern systems. I would like to offer you a position developing doctrine for the Army's next generation of sniper training." Ridge felt the weight of the offer settle on him. Doctrine development meant influence beyond Fort Benning, meant shaping how the entire Army trained its precision shooters for the next decade or more, meant legacy on a scale he had never considered. The position would be a 3-year assignment, the general continued, based here at Benning but with travel to other installations. You would work with Captain Vance and a team of subject matter experts to create a training program that becomes the standard across all branches. Are you interested? Ridge looked at Hargrove, who nodded slightly. This was the kind of opportunity that came once in a career, the kind that turned senior NCOs into names that lived in Army history books. "Yes, sir," Ridge said. "I am interested." Good, the general said. You start in 6 months. That gives you time to finish your current teaching cycle and transition your students. Colonel Hargrove will handle the administrative details. After the general left, Ridge sat down hard in the visitor chair. 3 more years. Not retiring at 60 but staying until 61, maybe 62 if they extended him again. 3 more years to build something that would outlast him. 3 more years to teach and mentor and ensure that the lessons he had learned over 40 years did not die with him. Is this what you want? Hargrove asked quietly, because you can say no. You have earned the right to say no. Ridge thought about Doc, about his son, about all the soldiers he had trained over 4 decades who had gone on to save lives because they knew how to shoot straight when it mattered, about legacy and purpose and the choice between fading away or burning bright until the very end. This is what I want, Ridge said. This is what Doc would want, to keep teaching until there is nothing left to teach. Then it is settled, Hargrove said. The next 6 months passed faster than Ridge expected. He finished the instructional cycle with his first class and watched them graduate with skills that would keep them alive in places where being slightly better than the enemy was the difference between going home and going into a box. He worked with Vance to refine the integrated training program until it was tight and effective and ready to be scaled across the Army. He mentored Castillo and watched the kid transform from an angry teenager into a disciplined soldier who had just been accepted to Ranger School. On Castillo's last day before he left for Ranger training, Ridge pulled him aside and handed him an envelope. The kid opened it to find a letter of recommendation written on official letterhead, signed by both Ridge and Colonel Hargrove and General Keating. It recommended Private First Class Anthony Castillo for the Special Forces Assessment and Selection course after completing Ranger School. Sergeant, I cannot accept this, Castillo said, his voice shaking. I am not ready for SF. You are more ready than you think, Ridge said. 6 months ago you were headed for a dishonorable discharge. Now you are headed for Ranger School with my recommendation in your file. Do not tell me you are not ready. Just do the work and trust the process. Castillo stood at attention and saluted, the gesture crisp and professional. Ridge returned it with equal precision. Then the kid broke protocol and extended his hand. Thank you, Sergeant, for believing in me when I did not believe in myself. Ridge shook his hand. Make me proud, Private, and make Doc proud. He would have liked you. After Castillo left, Ridge stood alone in the now empty classroom and felt the full weight of what the past 6 months had meant. He had buried his best friend. He had won a competition that validated his entire career. He had been given a position that would define his legacy. He had mentored a troubled kid and watched him become a soldier worth respecting. And through it all, he had kept moving forward because forward was the only direction that mattered. The day Ridge officially started his new position, he drove out to the cemetery before reporting to his new office. He stood at Doc's grave with the morning sun just starting to warm the headstone and the grass around it growing thick and green. Someone had left flowers recently, probably Hargrove, probably on the anniversary of Doc's death that Ridge had been too busy to remember. I got the job, Marcus, Ridge said quietly. The doctrine development position. 3 more years to build something that matters. 3 more years to make sure they remember us. The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves on the oak trees that provided shade for the dead. Ridge chose to interpret it as approval. I am scared, Bill admitted to the headstone. Scared I am not good enough for this. Scared I will let you down. Scared I will build something that fails and proves the critics right about old methods being obsolete. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the wind and the distant sound of rifle fire from the ranges and the birds that did not care about military funerals or legacy, or any of the things that consumed living people. But I am going to do it anyway, Ridge continued, because that is what you taught me. That fear is just information. What you do with that information is what defines you. He saluted the grave, holding it longer than regulation required, then turned and walked back to his truck. There was work to do, students to train, doctrine to write, a legacy to build that would outlast both of them. Ridge drove across the base to his new office in a building that smelled like fresh paint and new carpet, and the particular optimism of bureaucracy that thought the right program could solve any problem. Captain Vance was already there, laptop open, presentations loaded, ready to begin the work of transforming the Army's approach to precision marksmanship. They spent the day mapping out timelines and milestones and deliverables. They argued about methodology and compromised on implementation, and slowly built the framework for something neither of them could build alone. It was hard work, frustrating work, work that required Ridge to accept that his way was not the only way, and Vance to acknowledge that new was not automatically better. But it was good work, important work, the kind of work that would ripple outward through the Army and potentially save lives in places Ridge would never see and conflicts he could not imagine. As the sun set and Vance packed up his gear to leave, the young captain paused at the door. "Sergeant Bridger," he said, "I just want you to know that working with you has been the most important part of my career. You have taught me things they never covered at West Point. Things about patience and humility and what real leadership looks like." Ridge looked up from his notes. "You have taught me things too, Captain. Things about being willing to change. About accepting that the world moves forward whether we like it or not. About building bridges instead of walls." Vance smiled. "We make a good team, Sergeant." "We do," Ridge agreed. "Now get out of here. See you tomorrow." After Vance left, Ridge sat alone in his new office and looked out the window at Fort Benning spreading out below him. Somewhere out there, young soldiers were training on ranges that Doc had helped design, using techniques that Ridge had refined over 40 years, learning from instructors that he and Doc had trained. The work continued, the mission persisted, and the legacy was being built one student at a time. Ridge pulled out his phone and looked at the photograph of his son that he kept in his wallet. James would have been 39 now, old enough to have kids of his own, old enough to have softened toward his father, old enough to understand that Ridge's absences had not been about not loving him, but about serving something larger than family. Or maybe not. Maybe James would have stayed angry until Ridge died and the chance for reconciliation died with him. There was no way to know. The dead kept their own counsel. But Ridge liked to think that his son would be proud of what he was building now. Proud that his father had turned grief into purpose and loss into legacy. Proud that the old man was still fighting and still teaching, and still refusing to surrender to age or doubt, or the cruel mathematics of mortality that said everything ended eventually. Ridge put the phone away and turned off his office lights. Tomorrow he would start writing doctrine that would shape Army training for the next decade. Tomorrow he would mentor new instructors and refine programs, and continue the work that Doc had started and Ridge was determined to finish. But tonight he drove to a small house he had rented off base, the first non-military housing he had lived in since he was 18. He made dinner from scratch instead of eating at the chow hall. He sat on his porch and watched the sun set over Georgia pines and listened to the sound of silence that was not empty because it was filled with memories. And Ridge understood finally that legacy was not about monuments or medals or even the programs you built. Legacy was about the people you taught and the lives you touched and the small ways you made the world slightly better before you left it. Doc's legacy lived in every spotter who used his techniques. James's legacy lived in the second chance Ridge had given Castillo. Ridge's own legacy would live in the soldiers who learned from him and pass that knowledge forward to soldiers he would never meet. It was enough. Not everything he had hoped for, not everything he had lost, but enough. Ridge finished his dinner and cleaned his plate and walked out into the Georgia night. Somewhere above him, stars were burning billions of miles away, their light reaching Earth long after the stars themselves had died. Legacy was like that. Light that traveled farther than the source. Influence that outlasted the influencer. And William Ridge, Master Sergeant, United States Army, stood under those stars and made peace with the fact that he would die someday, but the things he had taught would not. That his eyes would fail and his body would break, but the knowledge he had accumulated would persist. That he was temporary, but the legacy was permanent. It was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all anyone ever got. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of rain that had not fallen yet but would soon. Ridge breathed it in and let it out and went back inside to prepare for tomorrow, because tomorrow was the only thing that mattered now. Tomorrow and the work and the students and the slow, patient building of something that would outlast him. And that, in the end, was the last shot that mattered. Not the one that won the competition, not the one that proved the doubters wrong, but the one aimed at a future Ridge would never see, fired with the hope that it would find its mark long after the shooter was gone. I spent weeks researching how veteran snipers train the next generation, and Doc Holliday's story hit me hardest. The idea that a dying man would choose to spend his final months spotting one last competition, not for glory, but to prove his friend still mattered. That's the kind of brotherhood civilians don't always understand. Question for you veterans out there. Have you ever had a mentor who refused to quit on you, even when they should have been resting? Or trained someone knowing it might be your last chance to pass on what you know? Drop your stories below. These are the conversations that matter. New here, subscribe. I tell stories like this every week.